Hey y'all, David here. Welcome back. Before we begin, I want to apologize for any sound or visual issues that crop up in this video. I'm in a new space, as you can see, and I'm still trying to figure out the best way to record. And I mailed a bunch of stuff, and my microphone hasn't arrived yet, so apologies for all that. So, growing up, I loved reading the comic strip Calvin and Hobbes. I remember stumbling onto a copy of one of its collections titled Scientific Progress Goes Boink on a shelf in my parents' house when I was like, I want to say 8 or 9, perhaps a little older, perhaps a little younger. I took a glance at the cover of this book, which had an image of a boy and a giant humanoid-looking tiger greeting what seemed to be a clone of the boy, exiting out of a cardboard box in the middle of his bedroom floor, and I was transfixed. I started reading this comic strip and I absolutely loved it. A few years after this, I had already collected every comic book collection of the strip that had been published up to that point. When I was recently visiting my parents' house before I came here to the UK where I'm studying, I ended up revisiting the comic book collections that I had gotten, and let me just tell you, Calvin and Hobbes is an even greater comic strip when you read it as an adult. It's got a lot more depth at times than I expected, and I am inclined to agree with the many others who say it may be one of the greatest comic strips ever written. For those of you who are unaware, Calvin and Hobbes is a daily newspaper strip that ran from the mid-80s to, I believe, the mid-90s, drawn exclusively by the artist Bill Watterson. It focuses on Calvin, a 6-year-old boy who is sometimes mischievous and sometimes egotistical, and who has a huge imagination. And it's just kind of about his life, I suppose. Specifically, it focuses on his relationship with his only friend in the world, Hobbes. Also, yes, Calvin and Hobbes were named after philosophers, if you're wondering. Hobbes is a tiger, and to everyone else, he appears to just be a stuffed animal. One which Calvin seems to have a weird attachment to. But to Calvin, Hobbes is alive. And it's rather unclear throughout the entire strip whether or not Hobbes is an imaginary friend or not. Nobody else can see him, true, but he can cause Calvin physical harm. For example, he enjoys pouncing on Calvin when he comes home from school. The weird, surreal liminal space between reality and fantasy that seems to be going on here is never fully explained in the strip, but Hobbes does seem to be in some shape or form alive. It's not just an imaginary friend. And Calvin's imagination and the strip playing with the reality or unreality of it is a frequent theme in the comic strip. He often makes inventions out of cardboard boxes, such as when he makes one into a time machine or into a duplicator, like he did in a storyline featured in that first comic book collection I had, hence the cover. And it's part of what makes the strip unique, this kind of blurring lines of reality. But that's not the only thing that makes the strip unique. The other thing that's really notable that everyone who's heard about the strip knows about is that its creator, Bill Watterson, refused to license it. There was no, and never will be, any official Calvin and Hobbes merch, no TV specials, and definitely no movies. But some have wondered what a Calvin and the Hobbes movie may look like. And I wasn't the only kid who grew up reading Calvin and the Hobbes collections, not by a long shot. And some of these kids didn't just wonder what a Calvin and the Hobbes movie would look like, they wrote fanfiction reflecting what they thought it could be. There's more than one example of some kid doing this, but today I want to talk about the only one which I have personally read. Calvin and Hobbes the movie, rewritten, by Swing123 and Garfield Odie. So this is a rewrite of a fic the author Swing123 wrote when he was younger, and which he eventually came back to a few years after the fact to try and improve. This fic is unique, you guys. Partly because it is part of something which has been at times called the Calvinverse. You see, Swing123 and Garfield Odie, the writers of this fic, were quite prolific writers in the Calvin and Hobbes fandom for a number of years. And this quote-unquote movie takes place in the continuity of an ongoing series of fics that they wrote for close to a decade, believe it or not. This series was framed as if it was a series of movies and TV seasons that were airing or being shown in theaters and the like. This movie, though, this thing we're talking about today, is the thing that takes place chronologically first in the timeline of their greater Calvin and Hobbes universe. Their Calvin and Hobbes expanded universe, I suppose you could say. And this whole continuity, this expanded canon, is so popular that it has its own TV tropes page, believe it or not. It is widespread enough that when I once randomly posted about it when I was on Twitter, I had a mutual suddenly be like, oh shit, you read that too? We had never spoken about Calvin and the Hobbes to one another, didn't know that he was familiar with it, and yet I just so happened to be friends with someone who also read this. That's how widespread it was. It was just a weird coincidence. And then when I posted on YouTube suggesting that I might do a video on this, I got comments from like 3 other people who also told me they read this growing up and they begged me to do this. And so, you know what? Screw it, you guys. We're doing this. It may be super niche even for this channel, but we're doing it. In this video, I want to read this fic to all of you. But before we begin, I want to say 2 things. Number 1, whilst I do really like this fic, it is not perfect and I will be critiquing it. There are things that I think the writers could have done differently or done better. However, number 2, the writers of this rewritten version of the fic were quite young when they wrote this. They were even younger when they wrote the first version, but they were still young when they wrote the rewritten version. As such, I'm not going to be too hard on them. If they, for example, borrow jokes or lines from other pieces of media, or if there are small issues with grammar and the like, I might point them out, but I'm not going to give them flack for it. The original version of this fic, the one that I'm not going to be reading because it's rough, you guys, let me just put it like that, was written, as I said, when these creators were quite young. It was specifically published between late 2004 to early 2005, and the written version, the one that I will be focusing on in this video, and the only one I've ever been able to read, was written between late 2007 to sometime in 2009. So, if I were to guess, based on the shift in the quality of writing, I'd say the writer was maybe between the ages of maybe 10 and 12 when he wrote the first version, and then maybe between the ages of 12 to 14 when he began writing the rewritten version. But that's speculation on my part. I'm not like a child development person. Maybe they were a bit older than that. Maybe they were a bit younger than that. I don't know. That's my best guess. I bring all this up because, as I said, these creators were quite young. So even if I'm going to be criticizing it, I'm not going to be super hard on it. I'll point to things that I wish had been done better, because even when I was like 12 or 13 myself and reading this, I thought that it could be done better. But I'm not going to be bashing it. And I expect that no one watching this is going to go bash it either, because this was written a number of years ago by people who are quite young. They might be embarrassed by this as far as I know, and they don't deserve to get harassed just because they wrote something when they were young. Basically, be nice is all I'm saying. I personally think it's wonderful that this person, who was a kid at the time, got to express himself, and a lot of people gave him very positive feedback because of it. And I don't want him or his co-writer getting harassment because of something he wrote like 15 or 16 or 17, it's actually 18 years ago. This might be my favorite piece of fan fiction ever, you guys. And not in a so bad it's good kind of way. And as we'll go on, I hope you'll start to see why I consider this my favorite fic, despite the fact that it has flaws and the writer was so young. And so, with that in mind, let us begin. Chapter 1, Summer Nightmare. Oh, side note, even though this is presented as if it's a hypothetical Calvin and Hobbes movie, it's not written in script format. Swing 123's intro. This is a remake of one of my very first stories on fanfiction, Calvin and Hobbes the movie. After reading it again for the first time in quite a while, I figured I could probably do better now. So, putting every shred of my effort into it, the way I'd really want to see it in theaters, I have rewritten the entire movie, and this one only. I'm not remaking Lost at Sea or Double Trouble. He wrote several quote-unquote movies in this series. Also, you'll notice that in the original Calvin and Hobbes the movie, Earl's crew of aliens are actually intelligent and vicious. When we move into the second movie, Lost at Sea, they begin to get lazy and less attentive, and in Double Trouble, they're the morons we all know them as today. This remake shall include the alien crew being incredibly stupid and moronic, just like in any of my other stories. So, yeah, this is not just a Calvin and Hobbes movie. This is a Calvin and Hobbes movie where they, stop an alien invasion of Earth. You know, now that I say it out loud, I realize how silly that sounds, but just bear with me, guys. Like, just trust me, this is great. I swear. The author's note continues. Also, I don't want to set off a chain reaction here. I really don't want everyone to be rewriting their Calvin and Hobbes movies just because I am, so don't, okay? That may sound a little egotistical, but A, very young kid, and B, as I said, this was like quite a popular fic at the time, and it had quite a lot of influence in the Calvin and Hobbes tag on fanfiction.net, so, you know, I don't blame him for worrying about this. One more thing and then I'll shut up, he continues. This story will be taking place as the same time as the last one, the summer after the last strip. The last strip is, it's actually beautiful. I don't want to start crying, but it's Calvin and Hobbes just getting onto a toboggan in the middle of a white winter wonderland and just expressing how magical the world is and just flying off on their toboggan to other adventures. It's very emotional. So this takes place after that. Therefore, the time pauser, MTM, mini duplicator, and all the other inventions have not been made yet. And Socrates, Dr. Brainstorm, Jack, and the others have not met Calvin and Hobbes yet. Like I said, there's a lot of shit in this expanded Calvin and Hobbes universe, and we're not going to have time to get into all of it. And now, without further ado, Swing123 says, I give you the new and improved Calvin and Hobbes the movie. All criticism is welcome. Speaking of people bashing this fic, when I was quite young, when I first encountered this guy's writing, I left some pretty nasty reviews on his stories because I found them derivative. I was young too. If he's watching, I'm really sorry. Like, it was really douchey of me. Some of the things that I was commenting on had been written like several years beforehand at that point. It was not good of me. I was a child. So I think the amount of work that you put into these stories is really admirable. Even as an adult, I think it's admirable. So just want to put my apology out there. I've got a platform, I'm going to use it. Chapter 1 begins. After I have some water. It was a regular day in a semi-regular neighborhood. Except for one particular detail. It was the beginning of summer. A school bus rolled down the small street until it came to a yellow house on the edge of the block. Slowly, the bus came to a stop at the front of the sidewalk. The very second the bus came to a standstill, there was a huge explosion from the doors. I'm free! Calvin screeched at the top of his lungs, and then I don't remember this, but there's a weird giant space in the fanfiction.net chapter, like on the website. There seems to have been some sort of formatting issue, I'm assuming, because the next sentence is just like a little while after that. Nearly ripping the door off of their hinges, Calvin flew down the sidewalk and came to a direct stop at the front of the door. He spun around and faced the bus. Ha ha! He screamed at it. You tried and tried to break my will. You thought I'd crack. You thought you'd drive me over the brink, but I didn't. You failed. Failed! The bus driver rolled his eyes and closed the bus doors. Calvin watched it go. Look at it run, he growled. Then he whirled around back to the door. The best day of the year, besides Christmas of course, has arrived! Summer is here! He yanked the door open. Tally-ho! He screamed. Pow! Suddenly, something orange collided with Calvin, sending him flying in the other direction. This is Hobbes pouncing on him, which I mentioned earlier. He does this every day. Ah! Calvin screamed as he and Hobbes went plowing into the dirt. There was a long moment of silence. Hobbes was the first to climb out and dust himself off. Another successful greeting, he decided, examining the trail of dirt that led from the front door to their current location. Side note, the credits I don't think are written in this fic, but in other fics within this universe, there is a cast list of who the writers wanted to voice each character. I can't remember who was going to voice Calvin off the top of my head, but I do remember that he specifically imagined Hobbes as being voiced by Tom Hanks. I can try to do a Tom Hanks impression, but I don't think it's going to sound very good. Calvin, who was beat up and covered in dirt, climbed out of the hole and rubbed the dust out of his eyes. Then he turned an evil look onto the tiger. Thanks a lot, you maniacal cat, he spat. Look how far away from the house we are now. Calvin, we're 20 feet from the house, Hobbes said. Exactly, 20 feet. How am I supposed to walk 20 feet to get to the house? Hobbes began. I'm a very busy man. I don't have time for walking. Hobbes heaved a sigh. And to make matters worse, I have to cross the road. Who has time to cross the road? Calvin, if you don't mind, I'm just going to leave now. Oh, yes, I do mind, Calvin hollered. I'm in a bad mood and you're going to hear all about it. Sit down. Hobbes sighed and sat down. First of all, you caused me to forget all about the first day of summer, so you'll pay for that. Second of all, I managed to get through today without Mo beating me up, and you did that. You'll pay for that too. Third of all, and at that very moment, the wind picked up and started blowing the trees and bushes around. Calvin and Hobbes looked around as the trees and bushes all started leaning in the direction the wind was going. Heavy wind, Hobbes commented. Suddenly, a large, high-pitched shrill emitted from Calvin's backpack. Agh! Hobbes screamed, leaping into the air and covering his head. Calvin shouted as well and threw his pack off. He unzipped it and looked inside. What is that? Hobbes demanded. Calvin rooted through the junk in his backpack and finally pulled out a small box. Oh, here it is. It's my long-distance walkie-talkie. I took it to school for show and tell. He paused. A couple weeks ago, actually. What the heck is this still doing in here? Never mind, Hobbes said, holding his ears. Can you shut it up? Nope, I have no idea what's wrong with it, Calvin replied, shaking the walkie-talkie as the screech continued to emit from it. Calvin! Hobbes screamed. And then, just as suddenly as it started, the wind stopped. And, right on cue, the shrill from the walkie-talkie died down too. There was a moment of silence. Huh, Calvin said. Anyway, where was I? Hobbes stared at him for a long moment, and he sighed. "You're about to give me reason number 3 of why you're in a bad mood," he said, glaring at the walkie-talkie, which Calvin threw back into his bag. I don't think this walkie-talkie's gonna come back later, but it's been a few years, to say the least, since I've read this fic, so, we'll see. We'll see where that goes. "Ah, now I remember," Calvin said. "Third of all, Mo is a big, fat, ugly toad, and his mother is a compost pile, and he has chopped up ham for a brain, and he's right behind you." Hobbes yawned. There was another moment of silence. Fourth one of the day, in case you're keeping track. Calvin stared at Hobbes. Finally, he spoke. "Hobbes, that's ridiculous. Mo is pretty stupid, but he'd never come within 20 feet of my house. Oh yeah, Mo is he's like the standard, school bully trope. He pops up every once in a while in the strip, so that's who they're talking about. He looks like this. I've probably already shown a picture of him on screen at this point. Now that I think about it, we might be 21 feet, Hobbes considered, staring back at the house. Exactly. Therefore, it is impossible for that ugly gorilla to be behind me right now. Besides, he goes to that summer camp. Camp Pine Tree or some such nonsense. Therefore, he has to be home at whatever hole in the dirt he lives in, packing all his dead squirrels in severed hands, since summer camp lasts all summer long." Dead squirrels in severed hands. New band name just dropped. "Summer camp only lasts 2 weeks, Calvin. Whatever, it is physically impossible for Mo to be behind me right now. Now shut up so I can continue to complain about him." And suddenly Calvin became aware of a large finger tapping him on the shoulder. He spun around. "What do you want, you creep?" he screamed. "This had better be good, or else I'll—" He paused. Mo was standing in front of him, glaring at him through his overgrown hair and his mini gang behind him. Have we ever discussed Mo's gang? Maybe so, but it's been a long time. Mo's gang consisted of 2 members. A kid about as tall as Mo with blonde hair, a green basketball t-shirt and black jeans, and another smaller kid that wore his cap on backwards with black hair, a yellow t-shirt, and blue jeans. Calvin didn't know their names, but they were just as cruel and weird as Mo. Oh, and they never talk. I don't know why, but they never do. Calvin stared at Mo for a long time, then whirled around back to Hobbes. "Hobbes, I blame you for all of this." Then he spun around back to Mo. "Mo, let me begin by discussing the Declaration of Independence, which clearly states that anyone has the right to free speech and their own opinion." I need a moment for that. That was kind of funny. Mo began cracking his knuckles. Calvin stared. "Let me also say that you're breaking all of our treaties and agreements by coming within 20 feet of my house, and I must warn you that I have a lawyer of a father, and he can sue you for all that you owe." Yeah, Calvin's dad, who, his parents aren't going to be too important to this fic, but he's like a patent lawyer. I think this comes up in 2 comic strips in the comics 10-year run, but that is canonical. Twinkie, yeah, he calls him Twinkie. This is a thing from the strip as well. "I'm here because you missed out on your daily beating. And this was the last day of school, and that's the most important beating of all." "Huh," Calvin said. "Well, let me state that you had your chance to beat me up today, but you blew it. And I won, fair and square." "You deliberately spent recess and lunch in the classroom," Mo said. "Do you have any evidence to back that up?" Calvin asked. "Listen, Twinkie, I'm in a good mood today, so I'll let you off the hook for $1. $1? Calvin hollered. "I don't have that kind of money. What do I look like, a bank teller? What happened to the regular quarter?" "I raised the price because of all the insults you threw at me," Mo said. "I see," Calvin began. "Well, let me just take Hobbes into the house here and I'll fetch you $1. Calvin turned around and walked towards Hobbes. Suddenly, Mo's 2 buddies stepped in Calvin's way. I would imagine that if this was an actual movie at this point, the camera angle would shift and all of a sudden we'd just see a stuffed animal version of Hobbes as opposed to the way that Calvin sees it. And it would just be static. "Very well, Mo. I shall have to resort to desperate measures," he said. "You mean begging?" Mo asked. "Right," Calvin nodded. He dropped to his knees and held up his hands and began moaning. Mo stared at him. Then he motioned for his crew to come here and they discussed the situation in whispers. Calvin cut his eyes around. It was then that he noticed that Hobbes had vanished. His eyes narrowed and he muttered to himself, "Stupid cat." Finally, Mo and his gang turned back to Calvin. "Okay, Twinkie, I'll let you live on one condition." Calvin's eyes blanked out. "You have to attend Camp Pine with me." Mo's gang began chuckling, and Calvin stared at Mo for a long time. "And what would be the point of that?" he asked. Mo raised his fist. "You're going to be my personal punching bag," he grinned. Calvin continued to stare at Mo. "And if I don't go," he asked. "You'll never see the light of day again," he growled. Calvin's eyelids lowered. "Mo, what's the point of not killing me now if you're just going to kill me when I go to summer camp?" he asked. Mo paused as if thinking about that. Then he raised his fist. "You're saying you want to be clobbered now?" he asked. "No, of course not. See you at Camp Pine, old buddy." Old pal, Calvin grinned. Good. Mo and his gang turned and started walking in the other direction, and Calvin watched them go. We're about to meet Calvin's parents, so just, hope you're ready for this. It makes it sound like there's, like, something really terrible or weird about them, but no, not really. You'll see. When he walked into the house, he found Mom in the living room, talking on the phone. Parents don't have names, and then Calvin doesn't even have a last name, so they're just Mom and Dad. Calvin ignored her and began shuffling towards the stairs. Okay, thank you, she said. Goodbye. Mom hung the phone up and cleared her throat. Calvin, she called. There was a moment of silence. Calvin, she called again. Again, there was no answer. Calvin! I don't know why she's got this shrill voice. No one on the planet sounds like this, so apologies to everyone. Calvin, get down here, she screamed finally. Calvin slowly climbed down from the stairs and walked towards Mom. Death row, next in line speaking, he said. Mom rolled her eyes. Calvin, I just wanted to tell you I've signed you up to a summer camp. Calvin stared at his mother for a long time. Very nice, he said finally. Don't bother to consult me. Well, I knew you were just going to say no, so why should I, Mom replied. Uh-huh, and let me guess, he said. It's called Camp Pine? Mom's eyes popped open, surprised. How did you know that, she inquired. I've been physically intimidated and threatened to be there. That's a thing. That's a really weird thing about this opening chapter. Why have this whole thing where Mo threatens him to attend Camp Pine when his mom was going to sign him up anyways? Surely just having his mom sign him up is a lot less contrived than him being blackmailed. It's kind of a moot point. The point is that regardless of what's going on here, he is going to summer camp, but I just wanted to mention it because I do feel like, oh wait, I forgot I was doing like a shrill voice for her. Mom said. Anyway, I have the brochure here if you're interested. I'm sorry to the world for this. Maybe I'll stop. I don't know. Mom handed Calvin a small booklet. Thanks, Mom, Calvin said expressionlessly. This will make excellent final reading. He took the booklet and walked up the stairs with it. If you need me, I'll be up in my room writing my will, he called. He slammed his door behind him. Mom rolled her eyes. Those child psychology books were such a waste of money, she sighed. And that's the end of chapter 1. Are we having fun? I gotta plug in my laptop because it's running low on battery, so just give me a second. But are we having fun? Are we invested? Do we want to know where this is going? I hope the mention of aliens got you excited. Okay, so chapter 2 is next, and it's titled Runaway Tiger. Incidentally, I'm going to be like skipping sentences or summarizing things on occasion, but if you're wondering how many words this is, it's about 55,422 words. For reference, that's approximately the length of a short novel. So we're going to be here for a while, guys, but I think we're going to have fun. Hobbes was sitting in Calvin's bedroom reading a Captain Mame comic book. When he heard heavy footsteps pounding up the stairs, he quickly closed the comic book and hid it under the pillow. He expected to see Calvin all beat up, black eye, tattered clothes, small limp in right leg, continuous insults that threatened to bring the bully back, stuff like that. He was, however, shocked to see Calvin enter the room in perfect condition. Why, hello, Calvin, he said. Did I miss something? Calvin glared at him. Okay, so Calvin screams at him for running away, and then he starts packing. He threw his backpack across the room onto a chair, which flipped over backwards onto the floor, and began ruffling through his desk drawer. Hobbes watched him, confused. Calvin, allow me to ask why you're so angry, he inquired, scratching his head. You just escaped Mo without a mark, and it's the first day of summer. What's wrong? What's wrong is that Mo has death-threatened me to attend some stinky summer camp for the sole purpose of beating me up. That's what's wrong. And also, your mom signed you up without telling you, regardless of that. So, I mean, you were kind of screwed either way. That's pretty tragic, Calvin, Hobbes said, pretending to be sympathetic. Oh, let me try that again. That's pretty tragic, Calvin. What are you going to do? Calvin walked over to his closet. Only thing I can do, he said, opening the door and ruffling through all his clothes. Complain and whine about it until it's time to go. Calvin pulled out a large, bright blue duffel bag, which was about half as long as Hobbes's height. I have 2 days to pack and complain to Mom about signing me up, he said. That won't nearly be enough time. Hobbes's eyes went from Calvin to the duffel bag in his hands. What's that for, he asked. Packing, what do you think? Calvin grunted as he began shoving all the clothes he could reach into it. Hobbes watched him for a moment. Do you have any other bags? He inquired, watching Calvin throw everything in the closet into it. No, I just have this one, Calvin replied. There was a moment of silence. It's a pretty small bag, Hobbes said. Yep, replied Calvin. Real small. You betcha. There was another pause. Come to think of it, a little too small to be holding all the contents of your closet and to not even start to bulge, Hobbes said, finally starting to get annoyed. Yeah, that's pretty odd, Calvin replied. He's just not going to acknowledge this. Yet. We'll get to it later. Calvin shut the closet door and effortlessly picked the duffel bag up and walked over to his desk with it. Hobbes sighed. "Perhaps for my sanity, an explanation is in order," he said, crossing his arms. "Sure, why not?" Calvin yawned as he began cleaning out the drawers in his desk. "It's a prototype for a genius invention. You see, Hobbes, I've managed to create a portal that leads straight into the great unknown. Or basically just an empty dimension. I found it fiddling the time machine. I found it whilst fiddling the time machine, I assume. This empty dimension you see is so incredibly huge that I can store an infinite amount of anything and everything into it, whatever size or density. So I began thinking, why not create a storage object that will inventory whatever I please? It can be as small as a speck of dust or as large as a blue whale." So he's got like a bag of holding, essentially. It's a scientific breakthrough, I'm sure, but until I can cram the portal into this thing, Calvin pointed at a small green cubicle box, "I have to use this duffel bag." Huh. Calvin grabbed the juice box and threw it into the bag. So in the Calvinverse, in this expanded universe, and this is the first appearance of this, one of Calvin's new inventions is something called the hypercube. I believe it is just a normal Rubik's Cube that is been repurposed to act as a portal to this bag of holding dimension. I believe it is called the hypercube because there is a invention in Jimmy Neutron that is also called the hypercube. So in other words, you've made another death trap invention that involves a totally different universe that appears to be empty, but will soon have mutant kangaroos coming out of it and destroying the planet with laser beams being shot from their noses, Hobbes said, putting his hands on his hips. "Yep, pretty much. You want to help me here? I have a lot to pack," Calvin said, glaring at his Tiger Companion. Tiger Companion is another band name, by the way. Hobbes sighed, and 2 days went by. By this time, Calvin had managed to cram almost everything he owned into his prehistoric hypercube. See? It is eventually going to become a hypercube. And soon, the only thing remaining in his bedroom was his bed, his desk, his rug, and a couple of chairs. His parents did not bother to ask Calvin how he managed to pack everything away, knowing they wouldn't get a straight answer. "Well, Calvin," Mom said, going over the brochure again the night before the camp began, "are you excited about going to summer camp tomorrow?" I think I'm going to have to stop doing this voice just because it's making it hard to read. It's like it's making me want to cough. But I'm still going to keep doing it because I'm feeling stubborn today, you guys, okay? Get used to it. I'm feeling stubborn. Well, if by excited you mean horrified and near the brink of insanity, then yes, I am excited. I'm overcome with excitement. Mom rolled her eyes. That's basically what parents only ever do in this. They just talk to him and then just roll their eyes. "You shouldn't be so nervous, Calvin," she said. "Summer camp is a lot of fun. They always have a lot of fun activities lined up." "Oh, right," Calvin said, turning back to the TV. Activities such as eject Calvin into the stratosphere, twist Calvin into a pretzel, and see how far Calvin's fingers can be folded back the wrong way. "Right," Mom said dully, putting the booklet away. "Anyway, time for bed." You know, I feel like a good parent would be a little more receptive to the fact that their child is expressing concern about being physically abused at this camp by his peers. But honestly, if you go back and read the Calvin and Hobbes strips now, I mean, a lot of this is just because, like, language around mental health and child rearing has changed, but they're awful parents. They're really awful parents. Like, Calvin may be a little monster, but they are still awful, and they certainly don't help. Anyways, "Sure, you just can't wait to get rid of me, huh?" Calvin shouted, pumping his fist into the air. "You'll be sorry once I come home missing limbs. You'll come to pick me up, and 3 of my toes will be missing. Patches of my hair will be burned and charred into singes, and my internal organs will be all in the wrong places, and I'll be missing one of my eyeballs." "Uh-huh," Mom said, standing up. "Come on, let's go." Calvin put up a huge fight, and for a while, refused to go to bed. It took Mom 15 minutes to finally get him into his room, and another 15 minutes to get him to stay in bed. "Go to sleep," Mom grumbled. "You need to get up early tomorrow." "That's great, Mom. Wake me up early on my final day on the planet," Calvin declared. "I refuse to go to sleep. I'm going to stay up and glare at the door all night." "Fine, glare at the door all night," Mom sighed. "Just be ready to get dressed tomorrow and gather up all your things." "Good night." I promise the mom is not an important character. She will stop talking soon. So the next day comes, and Mom burst into Calvin's room and pointed at his drawer. "You're going to miss the bus if you don't get up," she yelled. "Oh, there were some words I was hoping I'd never hear for another 3 months," Calvin groaned. Calvin slowly got dressed and then made his way to the door of his room. He exited his door and shuffled down the stairs. Dad was reading his newspaper at the kitchen table while drinking his second cup of coffee that morning. "Hey, Calvin, are you looking forward to summer camp?" I guess his dad sounds like Barney. We're gonna go with it. Get over it. "Summer camp builds a lot of character. They have canoeing, hiking, arts and crafts, and there's just so much more." "Right. All that stuff you mentioned requires work, Calvin grumbled, reaching into the cabinet for his chocolate-frosted sugar bombs. Dad ignored him and continued. The best part is, you're in the untamed wilderness, so it gives you a chance to get back to your primal instincts and enjoy the great outdoors. That's just great, Dad, Calvin muttered, pouring cereal into his bowl. You can cut paper and be a caveman as much as you want. I'll stick to the road of technology and cartoons that only last 3 seasons. I think by the time this fic had written, the Calvin and Hobbes, the series, fanfiction that they'd been writing for a number of years, was on its quote-unquote 3rd season, which is kind of funny. Calvin then goes back upstairs to get Hobbes, who's hiding under a blanket. Calvin has to convince him to go with him. Calvin berates Hobbes for being a coward. This is one of his strange quirks that he has in this Calvinverse series of fics. He's quite cowardly, and it gets a little irritating at points, but we'll see. Calvin ends up finding Hobbes after he runs out of the room and into the backyard, and he tells Hobbes that he has all the tuna and salmon in the house and that there is none at the house, and if he wants to eat any, he's going to have to come with. And so the bus is here. Calvin walked out onto the sidewalk holding the duffel bag in one hand and Hobbes in the other. He looked over at the green bus with the words Camp Pine written on it that had pulled up at his sidewalk. I think they mean the curb, not just the sidewalk, but I'm splitting hairs. I know, it's not a big deal. Then he saw the doors open, and the same bus driver sat in the seat staring at him, the one from earlier. Calvin gulped. It was going to be a long 2 weeks. Thus ends chapter 2. I think that's all I'm going to film for today. Maybe I'll film some more tomorrow. I'll see you guys, well, for you, in just a few seconds. Okay, new day of filming, slightly different angle, still working it out. Bear with me. Chapter 3 is titled Camp Pine. Slowly, Calvin made his way onto the bus. He threw a suspicious glance at the bus driver he was not supposed to see for another 3 months. The bus driver stared back at him. "You have seen nothing!" Calvin yelled, pointing a finger at him. The driver grunted and closed the doors. Calvin walked up the steps and into the narrow bus. He cut his eyes from side to side. He appeared to be one of the first people to have been picked up. The only other people he saw were Mo's gang, Alex, don't know who Alex is, and some other kid with buck teeth. So, fun fact, I don't know if he ever appears in the comic proper, but on the Treasury collection, not the Treasury collection, but the comic collection, Homicidal Psycho Jungle Cat, it's one of the Calvin and Hobbes book collections, on the back cover, there is an image of a kid with buck teeth and glasses, and I think that's, that might be what this is referencing. Or maybe I'm reading too much into it. I really don't know. Calvin sat down with Hobbes, a good 5 or 6 seats away from Mo. As the bus engine revved up and began moving again, Calvin unzipped his duffel bag and began rifling through it. Hobbes watched him. "I'm hoping you packed some OFF," he asked hopefully. I don't know what that is, but I'm assuming maybe that's like a insect repellent. I don't know. Let me Google. I'm on my computer. I may as well. It's not like I'm stuck on a script like I usually am. OFF is a insect repellent. I was correct. "Are you kidding?" Calvin demanded, looking up. "Do you think I'm leaving my property without something to protect myself with?" Hobbes breathed a sigh of relief. Calvin then went back to shuffling through, well, basically the entire contents of his room. He finally found the comic book he was looking for, zipped the bag back up, and sat back down in his seat. Okay. So he settles down to read a comic book. He says that he's not planning to get involved in any camp activities. He's just going to read comic books for the entire 2 weeks. He's also still bummed that Mo is coming, of course. And then Hobbes is like, well, at least it's just one kid from your school. Just then, the bus slowed. Calvin didn't even look out the window as the bus came to a complete stop and the doors opened. Calvin and Hobbes both heard the sound of footsteps coming up the stairs, but only Hobbes expressed any interest to see who it was. When he did, his eyes popped open. "Calvin? What?" Never mind what?" "Hi, Calvin," said a cheerful voice. Calvin looked up. It was Susie Durkins. So Susie is a girl who lives in the neighborhood that Calvin lives in, I think on the same block. It's a little unclear. I don't know why they had to drive a bit to get to her house, but that's a nitpick. And you know, like a lot of Calvin and Hobbes characters, everyone's kind of an archetype. So mom and dad are just a mother and father. There's the archetypal school bully. And Susie is the archetypal girl who the little boy main character hates, because he hates girls and thinks they're stinky. She, unlike Calvin, is more studious, more outgoing, a lot sweeter, yada yada yada. Calvin stared at her for a long time. "So, I'm assuming Leatherface is getting on next, right?" he said finally. Susie sat down next to Calvin, scooting Hobbes over. "What are you doing here anyway, Susie?" Calvin demanded. I thought you were going to get to work on next year's homework. Isn't that how you keep your sanity during the summer? Susie rolled her eyes. If you want to get pissed drunk and get hospitalized, take a shot every time someone rolls their eyes in this. Calvin, I think the better question is, what are you doing here? I go to Camp Pine every year. Parents desperate to get rid of you too, huh? Calvin considered, tapping his chin. You do know that summer camp is just a big babysitter so the kids' parents can remain in denial about summer arriving, don't you? Maybe for your parents, Susie muttered under her breath. The bus went on to pick up several other kids, most of which Calvin recognized from his classroom. For crying out loud, is everyone from my class getting on the bus? Calvin yelled as Candace took her seat next to Alex. Just about, Susie said. Everyone from our class does come to Camp Pine, actually. You're the one that finally completes it. If I had to go to the same summer camp as the guys I went to school with, there would be like a Friday the 13th situation on the camp counselor's hands. Those students would be dead. Okay, that's an exaggeration. I'm joking, obviously, but I loved summer. I hated the boys I went to school with. I went to an all-boys school, which is why I keep saying boys. I would throw a fit, is what I'm getting at. Anyways, Calvin is shocked by this, and he throws a little fit, then he sits down. Once Calvin took a seat again, the bus made it past the city. The only times Calvin had been on this road was when Dad dragged him and his family on another death trap vacation. Yeah, so his dad loves to take the family out onto these, horrible, camping trips for, a week, where there's no electricity on, an island in the middle of nowhere, and everyone hates it except for the dad. Anyways, in other words, the narrator continues, Calvin had affiliated bad thoughts with this road. And of course, dark thoughts led to weird fantasies. So, thing about Calvin, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, I didn't. He tends to disassociate a lot. And he tends to enter into his own fantasy worlds. And he's about to enter into one of them now. Specifically, he's going to enter into the persona and fantasy of being Spaceman Spiff, who's kind of like a Buck Rogers fighting aliens in outer space type character, if you're unfamiliar. Our intrepid hero, Spaceman Spiff, is taken captive by the evil Zarchers from planet X-821 to be taken to labor camp to be trained as a slave for their diabolical race, Calvin muttered under his breath, looking around the bus, which had become a giant spaceship. This is what I'm talking about. It's like, kid's got a great imagination. You know what? More credit to him. Spaceman Spiff looked around the dark ship. Green wires ran across the walls, and the seats were filled with green aliens that looked like giant bats. They all stared forward in an emotionless way, all lined up in the seats. Spaceman Spiff was tied up at the arms and seated next to another two aliens holding laser guns. So this is a thing that happens often in the comic. Regular stuff will be happening, and we'll suddenly see all of it through the lens of one of Calvin's fantasies. Spiff prepares his daring escape of leaping out into deep space, Spiff muttered under his breath, looking toward the window. Calvin checked on Hobbes and Susie. I imagine, again, we get one shot of Spaceman Spiff in the spaceship, and then we change angles, and it's just Calvin sitting on a bus chair, couch, bus seat. I don't know. Words are hard, okay? This is why I never wrote fan fiction, but these guys did. Hobbes was examining his claws, and Susie was reading the Camp Pine brochure. He narrowed his eyes and turned back to the window. Desperately, he began tugging at the window's base, trying to get it open. Curses, Spiff growled. They have super locks on the windows. Spiff's only chance is to dive into the middle of the aliens and escape through the doors. Spiff turned around and glared at the aliens through his black mask. They both were staring straight ahead, not paying any attention to the spaceman. I assume that this is Hobbes and Susie in real life. Spiff remained still for a moment, staring at the aliens, waiting for them to do something. Then he acted. Die, space scum! Calvin screamed, leaping through the air and tumbling to the floor. Susie, Hobbes, and everyone else spun around and looked at Calvin in shock. Calvin leapt to his feet and whipped from side to side. Rock! The aliens started screeching, holding their winged arms out to capture Spiff. Spiff growled and narrowed his eyes. Then with a snap, he cut the ropes to his arms and began running towards the front of the ship. Bat-webbed arms reached over the seats in an attempt to grab the spaceman. Spaceman Spiff leaped over to the front of the ship and spun around to the driver. He whipped out his death ray blaster and pointed it at him. Okay, you slimy space maggot. Stop this ship right now and release my spaceship from the compartment hold. I'm getting out of here. Instantly, the spaceship came to a dead stop. The driver turned and stared at Spiff through its bloodshot eyes. And then it opened its mouth. Gawk, goop, flark, yarg, hobia, sabak, grok! It screamed through its razor-sharp teeth. Spiff stared at it, still holding his blaster up. What? He asked. I said, give me that rubber band and sit down, the driver said to Calvin, leaning on the steering wheel. Calvin blinked. He looked back up the bus. Everyone was leaning over the side of their seats, staring at him with wide eyes. Oh, well, okay. Calvin handed the rubber band over to the driver. There you go. The driver took the rubber band, threw it in an ashtray, and started the bus's engine back up. Calvin cleared his throat and walked back to his seat, not looking at anyone. Susie stared at Calvin as he walked back up to her and sat down. Well, I suppose you're going to have some smart remark about this, correct? Calvin demanded, glaring at Susie. No, I'm getting nothing, Susie said, staring at Calvin with wide eyes. Good? Good. Hobbes? No, I think this is more of a silence moment, Hobbes replied. Good, so all of you can just shut up, Calvin growled, turning back to the window. He is so temperamental. I love him. The bus kept going, and luckily Calvin was able to spend the rest of the trip without breaking into another fantasy. The bus passes by a sign that says, Welcome to Camp Pine, and eventually it pulls to a stop. At once, everyone got up and started walking towards the exit. Well, almost everyone. Calvin sat on his seat, refusing to move. Okay, so he's still trying to stay, silent and out of sight. He's hoping that maybe he can sneak back to the city if he just hides himself, on his seat. Okay, but it doesn't work, and he ends up leaving. Calvin watched helplessly as the bus made a turnaround and started driving off in the other direction. Then he turned back around. The rest of the group was facing a small cabin with the sign Counselor on it. Calvin and Hobbes stared at it. Well, this is pretty nice, Hobbes observed, looking around the camp. There's an unpolluted little forest here, a big lake, little squirrels and chipmunks running around. We're surrounded by a beautiful mountain range. This might not be that bad. Why are there security cameras on the cabins? Calvin asked, glaring at a video camera hung from above the counselor's cabin's porch. The camera was fixed right on the group of kids, making a small beeping sound every few seconds. I'm imagining that, as he's saying this, the camera switches to a POV shot of the security camera, and it's got a little flashing record sign in the top left corner or something like that. I don't know, just setting the scene for you all. At that very moment, the door to the cabin opened and a man stepped out. He had a short-shaved hair and a goatee. He was wearing sunglasses, black pants, white sneakers, and a white t-shirt that had the Camp Pine logo on it. He was holding a clipboard and he began to read over all their names. Welcome to Camp Pine, the man said in a gruff voice, looking up and facing the kids. My name is John Howard Chill. I'm your head counselor. Alex, a small kid with his baseball cap on backwards, raised his hand. Oh, so that's who Alex is. Must have been a slight, editing error at some point. Yes, John said, turning to him. What happened to Counselor Bob? He asked, putting his hand down. John stared at him for a moment. He couldn't be with us this year, he said, putting the clipboard on a table on the porch. He's in New York on an important business trip. Doing what? Susie asked. John turned and stared at Susie. I don't know what he's doing. He didn't fill me in on all the details. The point is, I am your substitute counselor for this year. Calvin raised his hand. Yes, Calvin? John asked, turning to Calvin this time. Okay, ignoring the fact that you conveniently know what my name is, I would like to ask what the chances are of something horrible happening to my person, Calvin said, crossing his arms. What do you mean? John inquired, raising an eyebrow. Oh, I don't know, Calvin said, rolling his eyes around. Mutant flesh-eating worms emerging from the ground after an electric tower has been knocked over, being bitten by a giant spider, thus turning me into a giant spider. Some homicidal British guy releasing a swarm of killer bees on us, or say, maybe physical abuse? I think, and I could be wrong about this, I think all of those scenarios might be from old MST3K episodes, but I'm not sure. I mention this because, although it's not clear yet in this fic, the writers of this were big Mystery Science Theater fans. And if you don't know what that is, I'll explain it later when it's more relevant. John stared at him. You're talking about bullying? He said finally. Oh, sure, that could be used as a hypothetical example, Calvin shrugged. If anyone is caught bullying another person here at Camp Pine while I'm in charge, they will be suspended and sent home, John said, scanning the group of kids. I will not tolerate it here. Mo turned a glare onto Calvin. Let me explain the rules for everyone new here at Camp Pine, John said, taking out his clipboard. Breakfast is at 7 o'clock sharp. Lunch is at noon and dinner is at 5. While you're here, you'll be participating in activities such as canoeing, hiking, and arts and crafts. Calvin groaned, but John ignored him and continued. It's been a while since I've read anything by these writers, and this might be just a side effect of how young the writers were when they were writing this, but there aren't a lot of compound sentences. Everything's like a very short, to-the-point sentence. It reminds me a lot of children's books, actually, that do similar things. So maybe they're a bit younger than I thought when they were writing this. Maybe not. I don't know. I'm just kind of flagging it because I think it's interesting. John sighed and continued. At this point, I'm going to assign you each a cabin where you'll be living in for the next 14 days. We have 4 cabins in total. 2 will be for the girls and 2 will be for the boys. After you've been assigned your cabin, I'd like you to go and unpack." Calvin groaned again. John turned and glared at Calvin. "Do you have a problem?" he demanded. "No, of course not. Why would you think that?" Calvin asked innocently. John rolled his eyes, take another drink, and turned back to the group. "Now, if you would all please come into the cabin here so I and my assistant counselors can assign your home for the next half-month." Calvin groaned. John glared at Calvin, then turned and walked into the cabin. The kids followed. Calvin and the Hobbes paused, though, and for a moment they all just stared after him. Then Hobbes spoke. "Nice fellow, that chill guy," Hobbes commented. This would have been a perfect moment for Hobbes to say that this chill guy seemed chill. I'll see myself out. I'm sorry. "Yeah, right," Calvin muttered. "He's about as creepy as Torgo in swim trunks. I can't believe I'm going to have to live with him for 2 weeks." So Torgo is a character from perhaps one of the most famous MST3K episodes, Manos, the Hands of Fate. MST3K is, I don't even know how to describe it. I could describe it, but it would take too long. But basically, it was this TV show which broadcast really horrible old movies and B-movies. And there was kind of a frame story where there was a guy stuck on a spaceship and forced to watch them with robots. And as the movie played, the guy and the robots would make jokes at the screen. Torgo is from Manos, the Hands of Fate, considered to be one of the worst movies the show ever covered. He looks like this. Anyhow, that ends chapter 3. We are moving on to chapter 4, which is titled Camp Activities. I did read this not so long ago that I completely have a blank mind about what goes on in these chapters. I can pretty much summarize everything that happens in these chapters without reading through it, so that saves us some time. But just to give some context, Swing 123's author's note at the top is this. For this part, I have combined 3 chapters together because I thought I spent too many chapters dwelling on Calvin's camp activities and not enough on the main plot. Even this kind of goes on for a bit longer than I think it should have. Basically, we get this montage of various camp activities, and Calvin keeps making a fool of himself. We meet Earl, who is an assistant counselor to John. Keep that name in mind. Earl is going to be important later. All of the camp counselors, incidentally, seem to be wearing sunglasses at all times, even when they're inside, and with the exception of the head counselor, they seem very stupid. You can probably guess where this is going if you remember the author's note from the very beginning of this fic. There's like a sewing contest or a race. I think it's a race. Calvin loses and Susie wins, and he is absolutely livid. "She cheated," Calvin screamed murderously as Susie collected her trophy and prize money. "Gee, that's horrible," Hobbes said, rolling his eyes. "It's not like you cheated or anything. He must have done something to try and cheat. It's not important. Let's keep going." "That's right. She took an unfair advantages and won under spurious circumstances." Spurious. I don't think I said that right. Calvin yelled. "She must have concocted a diabolical scheme to invent running shoes better than mine." "Yes, it's totally normal for 6-year-old girls to invent high-tech running shoes and cheat in races," Hobbes nodded. "And to make matters worse, she took that chunk of gold medal and money that rightfully belongs to me," Calvin shouted. Okay. Blah, 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 blah. We meet another camp counselor named Zach, who says this to the campers. "Hi, I'm Zach," he yelled goofily. "My knot master has told me to tell you little children to go sit in a canoe. Now, my knot master has told me to take a hike. See ya." It took me a second, but I think he means canoe. As they're grumbling about having to go canoeing, we cut back to the security camera attached to the camp counselor's cabin, and it seems to be following Calvin specifically. The narration says that his reflection is showing in the lens. So that's a nice little visual detail for you all. I promise I'm not going to skim read through this entire fic, but this chapter is probably the weakest one in the entire story. It goes on for way too long, and it's rather repetitious. Susie basically has continued to beat Calvin at all these activities, and he is angry as fuck about this at this point, because how dare she, his arch nemesis and a stupid girl who has cooties probably or something, how dare she win? Calvin tells Hobbes that he's ready to take revenge on Susie, and he and Hobbes head back to the cabin. This top-secret meeting of GROSS, Get Rid of Slimy Girls Club, is now called to order, Calvin said, doing a salute. So Calvin and Hobbes have a club called GROSS, or Gross. It stands for Get Rid of Slimy Girls. For some reason, the last letter of the last word is used as part of the acronym. And basically they use this club to just play horrible pranks on Susie in the comics, and that's probably what they're about to do now. Both Calvin and Hobbes were wearing newspaper hats. They had taken the sheets off of all the beds and had hugged them as curtains around the entire cabin. The doors were all locked and the windows were closed up. "Time for roll call," Calvin said, holding up a piece of paper. "Dictator for life Calvin is present." "President Hobbes is present," Hobbes said. "Excellent. Glad everyone could make it," Calvin said, looking up. "Now then, before we begin, Secretary Hobbes will read off the minutes of the last meeting." The meeting minutes are read out, and it's just a description of the two of them getting into a fist fight. I will say that even though this chapter in particular goes on for very long, one thing that I do appreciate that this fic does is that it tried to make space for as many bits and pieces of Calvin and Hobbes recurring gags or imagery as possible. So, for example, we got the Spaceman Spiff thing from earlier. I skimmed over it because it was part of the long list of camp activities, but there was another bit where Calvin disassociates and starts imagining himself as the detective persona he sometimes takes on, called Tracer Bullet. And now we have Get Rid of Slimy Girls, which is another major part of Calvin and Hobbes lore and a recurring aspect of the comic that they've just about managed to slip into the story in a way that I think actually is quite seamless. And I don't know, I appreciate that, to be honest. As many of you are aware, we are being subjected to a form of child abuse known to most parents as summer camp. This is like some dialogue out of a Kids Next Door episode, I swear, Calvin said. Also attending is the club's mortal enemy, Susie Durkins. Susie has publicly humiliated the dictator for life, and for that, revenge must be carried out. Hobbes began writing, and Calvin began pacing. "The only question to this problem is how we are going to go about delivering our vengeance upon her. Since everyone is under the watchful eye of that chill freak, blasting Susie with a water balloon right out of the blue is out of the question. Any other suggestions?" You know, this is a nitpick. And I'm just commenting on it because it just crossed my mind. But apparently anyone who bullies another camper and is caught doing so is going to get suspended and sent immediately home. Calvin could just throw a water balloon at Susie Durkins, get his little revenge. I mean, it's stupid. She didn't do anything to him. And then could get in trouble and could get sent home. And then he would be fine. He could enjoy the rest of the time that he would have spent at camp back at his parents' house like he wanted to. But obviously we can't do that, because if we did do that, we wouldn't have a story, as you'll see as this fic goes on. But I don't know, that I've read this about half a dozen times over the years, and that's never crossed my mind, actually. Apparently we're going to have to wait until both Chill and Earl are gone, and when Susie is in a different part of camp that security cameras aren't set up at. "Oh, I have the security camera problem solved," Calvin said. "Observe." Calvin turned and began ruffling through his duffel bag. He pulled out a small black squirt gun. Hobbes stared at it. "The transmogrifier gun?" he inquired. Yeah, so there's Calvin has a transmogrifier gun where he points, he thinks, and it transforms things. I believe in the comic strip it's technically blue, but it's possible that maybe the writers of this didn't have any color versions of the collections, so they maybe weren't aware of that. I don't know. Calvin chuckled and turned to the security camera still hanging from the corner of the ceiling. Oh, so they have the security cameras inside as well. That's not gross or creepy. He closed one eye and aimed the gun. Zap. Hobbes blinked as he watched a comb fall from the ceiling and land on the floor with a clank. There was a moment of silence. "A comb?" he demanded. Calvin glared at him. "Well, what do you want? I was working on short notice. You try and come up with something creative in less than 5 seconds. "Okay, never mind," Hobbes said, rolling his eyes. "Take a drink." "Now, the only thing we have to worry about now is John and that other guy. Earl. Whatever. We have to think about this for a moment. When is John not breathing down our necks?" There was a moment of silence. Again. "Maybe we should be taking shots for those as well." "When he's asleep," Hobbes suggested. There was another moment of silence. Calvin gave Hobbes a blank stare. They talk a bit more. They haven't figured out what they're going to do. They adjourn the meeting. And when they walk out, despite the fact that it was sunny outside, all of a sudden there's a large clap of thunder and it's pouring rain. Calvin and Hobbes then go to eat at the cafeteria, or the mess hall, I guess is what it's called at summer camp. I don't know. I never went to sleepaway camp. All the sleepaway camps I heard about were super sporty, and I didn't want to do that. I just wanted to go to computer camp, and that's what I did. So I don't know what normal summer camp's like, but I think it's called a mess hall. They sit down, they start eating. It's still raining, and Hobbes stares lazily outside into the rainy darkness through a window. Suddenly, the narrator says, something happened. Suddenly and out of nowhere, the silhouette of something large moved across the window, and then out of sight again. It happened so quickly, Hobbes barely had enough time to see it. His eyes popped open and the hair on his back began to stand up. Was he seeing things? No, he had saw it quite clearly. Hobbes stood up and walked over to the window. He squinted his eyes and stared out past the water trickling down it and into the darkness. Everything was still. Boom! Suddenly, more lightning streaked across the sky and lit up the campground with another tremendous boom. Hobbes cut his eye from side to side and looked hard in the split second of light he had. Nothing was there. "Hobbes, what are you doing?" Calvin demanded, his mouth stuffed with sandwich. "Oh, nothing. I just thought I saw something moving out there." "Huh, it's probably one of the counselors, running around and singing in the rain, or whatever it is they do. Come over and sit down, or I'm taking your sandwich." "I don't know, Calvin," he said, picking his sandwich up. "It didn't look like any of the counselors." "Uh-huh," Calvin said, taking a bite out of his sandwich. "Well, how am I supposed to know who it was? Maybe it was V." "Who?" "The disembodied head that chants, 'John Stewart killed me,'" Calvin replied. I'm unsure of what that's a reference to. If you're aware, sound off in the comments to please enlighten me. Hobbes rolled his eyes. "No, Calvin, it had a torso. I'm pretty sure of that," he said. "Well, there's still a variety of things it could have been," Calvin said. "Shall I list it off?" "No, your lists are infinite holes," Hobbes sighed. "Just forget it. It could have just been the rain on the window." Calvin shrugged and took another bite out of his sandwich. Hobbes took another bite out of his sandwich as well. He turned his head and scanned the window one more time, then turned away from it. And it was about then that things started going downhill for Calvin and Hobbes. Way downhill. New day of filming, new angle, still figuring it out. I may do something radically different in the next video. The good thing about this angle is that my laptop is right underneath the camera, and so I'm not going to be like looking to the side in order to look at it. And I don't know, these are the things I think about and I worry about, but maybe no one notices or cares. So we are on chapter 5, the invasion. Actually, before we begin, I want to show you guys something. I crochet, and look who I just finished a couple days ago. I made Hobbes. He's a little, he's not the most professional looking thing. I'm a bit of an amateur. I'm not great about details, but I'm really proud of him. All right, buddy. You just sit there out of sight next to the Gerb plushie, which I think I've shown in the video before, and just listen to your story, okay, buddy? Good guy. So chapter 5 is titled The Invasion. This is another one where I'm just going to end up skimming through. They decide that they're going to try and get Susie with a water balloon in the middle of the night after she heads back to her cabin, or something to that effect. They're communicating through walkie-talkies, and again, they hear some weird feedback from the walkie-talkies, some strange voices. So the walkie-talkies do in fact come back. I had misremembered that. Okay, they fail to douse Susie. I'm skimming, I know. I just can't be asked to go through the play-by-play here. I'm sorry. So they're sneaking around in the middle of the night, and then they encounter a strange figure in the bushes, or rather Calvin does. And he thinks it's Hobbes at first. He's like, "Hobbes, when did you start like breathing heavily?" And this is when Hobbes is like, "Calvin, I'm not next to you." "Calvin, look at the tree to your left," Hobbes grumbled. Calvin looked up, he scanned the immediate area and saw, Hobbes waving at him from the tree nearby. There was a long moment of silence. Take a drink. And this is when they realize that whatever has been breathing heavily next to Calvin, it's not Hobbes, it's something else. Suddenly, a low growling reached Calvin's ears. He turned around and his eyes popped open. There was a pair of glowing yellow eyes staring at him through the darkness. There was a pause and Calvin gulped. "Get out of my way! Move over! Monster, help!" There was a large explosion of leaves and branches, and Calvin burst from the bushes, making a beeline to his cabin. Hobbes is somehow already there. They're panicking because there was a monster out in the campgrounds. They lock the door, and this is when there's a banging on it, and they look outside, and it's Mo and his gang, because I guess, I must have missed this when I was skimming, but they're rooming with Calvin and Hobbes. "Ah, hello, roommates," Calvin yelled, holding his arm outward. "By any chance did you see any bug-eyed, octopus-bodied freaks walking around outside?" The kids glared at Calvin. Calvin stepped aside and the 5 kids walked inside. He glared suspiciously outside, slowly closed the door, and locked it again. It only took the kids 15 minutes to brush their teeth, put on their pajamas, and in Mo's case, shave, and get ready for bed. Guys, precocious puberty is not fun, to my understanding. So it's lights out, and Calvin and Hobbes are like, "You know what? There's something out there. We need to take turns doing guard duty." The night wore on. Hobbes yawned and held his arm up. He pushed a button on his digital watch and a green LCD light came on. Hobbes checked the time. 11:23. This is what I'm talking about when I talked about the lack of compound sentences. You could have literally just written, Hobbes yawned and checked his digital watch. The time said 11:23. Maybe there's like a semicolon there somewhere. But like, instead it's 3 separate sentences. I don't know. And like, there's so much detail, like pushing the button on his watch and the color of the LCD light, all these little things. And like, I'm not a writer, at least not like a very professional or very experienced one, but this does strike me as like Kind of an amateur writing mistake, in my opinion, because none of these details are really important. Hobbes is starting to nod off, and then he hears a noise. Creak! Hobbes' eyes popped open. He bolt straight up in bed and looked around. Everything was normal except for one small, tiny detail. The door had somehow unlocked and opened itself and was now wide open to the world. Okay, Hobbes, I don't want to alarm you, but I think something has just infiltrated our barriers and entered the fort, he whispered. Hobbes glared at him. I think that's what I told you, he growled. Calvin scanned the undersides of all the beds and looked around on all the walls. Nothing seemed out of order. Okay, Hobbes, Calvin said, looking around. Maybe it was a false alarm. What are you talking about? Hobbes demanded. The door just unbolted itself and opened up. There could be a very reasonable explanation for that, Calvin said. Really? Hobbes said. And what's that? Door lock gremlins, of course, Calvin said. Now come on, if we wake up anybody in here, they'll blame it all on us. With that, Calvin switched his flashlight off and started back towards his bed. Hobbes looked around, then followed, but suddenly he stopped, dead in his tracks. His eyes burst open and his mouth dropped open. Gasp! He wheezed. Calvin looked up. He asked dully. Hobbes pointed at the left corner of the room. Calvin looked around. There was a large, dark shadow residing there, facing the boy and Tiger. There was a pause. I'm counting that as a moment of silence. Oh, Calvin said. Forgot to check over there. The shadow was still for a moment, but then suddenly it expanded outward, making a whoosh of cold air go through the cabin, and started reaching out to other parts of it, engulfing it in total black. Hobbes tried to scream, but it just kind of died in his throat, so instead he made some kind of high-pitched gargling noise. That seemed to attract the shadow's attention, and suddenly it began moving toward Calvin and Hobbes. The two of them began backing up. They bumped into the wall next to the door and stood there, unable to go anywhere else, as the shadow kept coming. Then it stopped right in front of their faces. Calvin and Hobbes stared at it. Calvin and Hobbes stared at it with petrified fear. Suddenly, a large gust of wind moved throughout the cabin, and wide yellow compound eyes burst open in front of the two. Bright red pupils rolled down from behind its head and fixed right onto Calvin. Calvin and Hobbes stared at it. It stared at Calvin and Hobbes. Then, ... Ugh! Calvin and Hobbes both screamed to the top of their lungs, making the cabin shake. Ah! The shadow screamed even louder, stumbling backwards at the duo's sudden outburst. The kids inside the cabin jumped in shock. Mo bumped his head on the underside of the bunk bed above him. Hobbes frantically began unlocking the door and ripped it open. Calvin grabbed his duffel bag off the floor, threw it over his shoulders, and flew toward the door. By this time, the dark shadow had completely vanished from sight, as it retraced back into its corner and disappeared. Calvin and Hobbes raced down the hill toward the lake. Once they got there, they paused at the shore and looked around frantically. Hobbes, what was that thing? Calvin shouted, looking up toward the cabin. An afterthought? Hobbes considered. Calvin glared at him. I don't get the joke. I'm lost here, you guys. Can't help you, I'm afraid. Hobbes, this is serious. We could have been killed. He paused, which actually is pretty cool when you think about it, he contemplated. Hobbes rolled his eyes. The point is that something was in that place trying to eat us. It was big, black, and had yellow eyes, and it was creepy. It was like that thing crawling down the hill toward us in fast motion, Hobbes asked. Calvin looked up. Right above them in one of the hills, something jet black was crawling downwards towards them. It was reaching forward with a black arm, grasping the ground and pulling itself forward. It's very Lovecraftian, to be honest, like what I'm imagining right now, which isn't really the tone that I think this movie's going for, but that's what comes to mind. I don't know, just tentacles on the hill. Yeah, one of those, Calvin nodded. There was a pause. Ah! Calvin and Hobbes screamed, running around in circles for a moment, then rushing off towards John and Earl's cabin. John and Earl's cabin. Okay. Oh, maybe Earl isn't stupid. Maybe it's the other aliens, but John and Earl are not stupid. They rush towards their cabin, bang on the door. Nobody answers. The large shadow is darting towards them. It's coming closer and closer, and Calvin looks around frantically. In total blind terror, he grabbed Hobbes' arm and started running off with him towards the thick forestry beside the cabins. He paused at the edge of the woods. He looked back toward Camp Pine. Calvin, what are you doing? Hobbes asked nervously. Somehow the idea of being murdered by bears and rattlesnakes doesn't terrify me as much. You? Hobbes stared at Calvin for a long moment. You guys, you're being chased after. Get a move on. Calvin, Hobbes began, you're not suggesting we go in there. Yeah, sort of, Calvin said. Calvin, we can't go in there. There aren't any trails. Just then, a loud, high-pitched screech rang out through the campsite. Calvin and Hobbes spun around. Right before them was a giant boulder embedded into the ground. Slowly, their eyes rolled up toward the top. A large black tentacle was placed at the edge of the rock, and something was climbing up over it towards them. On second thought, I could use a brisk jog, Hobbes said, backing up toward the forest. How about you? Couldn't agree more, Calvin shivered. Let's fly. Help! Calvin and Hobbes both screamed, taking off into the forest. Oops. That's the last word of the chapter. Incidentally, this was probably clear before this point, but You know how I mentioned that Calvin has this huge imagination and he makes all these machines with cardboard boxes and things? In the Calvin verse, the machines actually work. It takes a very specific side in the real and unreal liminality of the comic. It's not as vague. It's definitely all real. I think this is explained in a later fic, like one of the last ones that were put out, but I'm not sure. Personally, I kind of never wanted it to be explained. I didn't really care how he's able to make duplicators and time machines out of cardboard boxes. I don't know, it's just, it never bothered me. Within the context of this universe, I mean. It's getting really warm in here, but I have to change shirts because there's like a huge logo of a camp I used to work for, and on this t-shirt, and I don't want to I want to keep parts of my life private, you know, so just give me 1 second. Chapter 6 is titled Marooned. What do you mean he's gone? John demanded, standing in the middle of Calvin's cabin. John, Earl, and all the counselors and all the kids had gathered around cabin 2B. He just left, sir, Alex said. We were all asleep and he just suddenly screamed, grabbed his bag, and ran off. John pushed his sunglasses into place. Yes, oddly enough, the man was still wearing his sunglasses in the pitch darkness. Earl and the other counselors were too. If that was the case, I mean, I would just assume that they were aliens, and I don't even believe in aliens, but if I went to summer camp and everyone was wearing sunglasses, even indoors, it's either aliens or a cult. I'm not sure which one would be worse. Earl turned around to one of the counselors before him. Jay, do you have the security footage? He demanded, glaring at the man before him. Jay stared at Earl for a long time. Okay, so Earl is smart, as is John. It's the other aliens besides them who are stupid. Yeah, well, about that, he began. John looked around at the counselors. What did you do now? He demanded. You destroyed them, didn't you? Earl said dully. The counselors exchanged nervous glances. Well, Jay began, we were trying to play baseball, but every time we threw the ball, it somehow went into the cameras and hit them. John and Earl stared at Jay for a long moment. Have you tried not throwing the ball at the cameras? Earl asked, his eyes narrowing. How do you know when he's wearing sunglasses? There was a long pause as Jay and Dave exchanged glances. Well, I guess we never thought about that, Jay started. Earl sighed and his head fell to his chest. John buried his face into his hands and groaned. Okay, Earl said, so we don't have any footage of what was going on. He turned to the confused kids before him. Did any of you perhaps witness this latest episode of his? The kids all exchanged glances and nobody moved. I see, Earl sighed. Earl leaned into John's ear and hissed something into it. Nobody heard it, but they could tell Earl wasn't very happy about the situation. John turned to the counselors. All right, he said to them. I would like you all to do a thorough search of the forestry around here. The counselors all reeled back in shock. But we need our beauty sleep, Ernie protested. Is it Ern or Ernie? It's E-R-N-E. Is that a name or is that a typo? John stared at them blankly. There was a moment of silence. Well, let's get started then, Ernie said suddenly and cheerfully. Hooray for searching! The counselors all yelled, and with that, they all split up and went into the forest. As for the rest of you, Earl said, turning back to the children, I would like all of you to go back to your cabins for the night. We have everything under control. What if you can't find him? Alex asked nervously. Earl turned and stared at him. We'll contact search and rescue. You say he only ran off half an hour ago, he asked? Yeah, he's been gone about 25 minutes. Alex nodded. He can't have gotten that far, John said, turning and staring off into the forest. It's the middle of the night, and the terrain is too rough to get through very quickly anyways. Now I want you all to go back to bed. We'll have everything back to normal by morning. The kids exchanged worried glances, then went off to their cabins. What are we supposed to do now? Earl asked, turning to John. This is just ruining everything. John rubbed his chin. If the crew doesn't find him, we'll be forced to call search and rescue to keep these kids from getting suspicious, Earl said. And then everything will be out of our hands. I want to know what just happened tonight, and I want to know how to fix it. John was silent for a second. They'll find him, he said quietly. The human body needs rest. With the kind of mountainous landscape around us and the fact that their body naturally rests at this time, he can't have gotten far. Page break line, and we are back with Calvin and the Hobbes. Okay, Hobbes, I'll set the time machine on autopilot and it'll steer us clear of any danger, Calvin grinned, reaching into his duffel bag and pulling out the cardboard box. So he does have a time machine, and I guess he has retrofitted it so that it can also just fly normally. Calvin, are you sure this is a good idea, he asked. Would you rather run through the forest all night? Calvin asked, turning to him. Hobbes blinked. Well, good. Get into the box, Calvin said, climbing inside and pushing some buttons. I'll just set the coordinates to avoid all flesh-eating zombie freak settings, and then I will steer us back to the camp in the morning. Are you sure? Hobbes asked. Of course I'm sure, Calvin spat. Have I ever led you astray? There was a pause. Yes, several times, actually, Hobbes said. Well, this will be the exception. Put your vortex goggles on, Calvin replied, pushing the go button on the box. Hobbes complied and put the goggles on, along with Calvin. Vroom! Suddenly, all of the buttons on the machine lit up, and the motor began humming. The go button began glowing bright green. Slowly, the cardboard box lifted off the ground, swaying slightly as the humming became faster. Leaves and small pieces of dirt flew out from underneath the box as it raised itself higher into the air. Then the back of the box, which had 2 yellow circles drawn on them, began glowing brightly, lighting up the forest. Boom! A lot of automatopoeia in this, it's fun. Tremendous force, the box roared forward, dodging trees and bushes, but heading straight on towards the Pine Mountain range. Calvin turned to Hobbes. There, you see, the danger is clearly at the camp right now. The box is programmed to avoid it all night. And then, Hobbes began, then it will take us back to that raging death trap, Calvin replied. But for now, let's try and get some sleep. Calvin, how am I supposed to sleep comfortably in a humming cardboard box that's bolting through a forest? Hobbes demanded. How am I supposed to know? Calvin responded. Use your imagination. You know, there's not a lot of space in the cardboard box to begin with. Like, it can just about fit the 2 of them. I don't know how they're gonna lie down. And with that, Calvin reached into his duffel bag, pulled out his pillow and blanket, and curled up in the front of the box. Nighty-night, he grinned. Hobbes glared at him, and the night wore on. Around 3 in the morning, Hobbes finally managed to doze off. Next time you get the chance to sleep in a flying cardboard box, don't do it. It's funny. We cut to later. It's morning, the sun is rising, and Susie Durkins is in her cabin, getting up. Susie sat up and yawned. She got out of her bed and walked over to the window, and her eyes popped open. There were several yellow trucks parked along Camp Pines Drive-In. Several people were gathered around the camp. They were all wearing yellow uniforms, and they were looking around the area. John, Chill, and Earl were talking to 2 of the men, as well as Calvin's parents, whose eyes were wide with fear. The other counselors, however, were just standing around, grinning and staring off into space. What the heck? She began. Then she remembered the events of last night. Oh no, she sighed. I've been critical of this fic, but I do really like it, and I do really like this moment with, like, them running away, and then, like, search and rescue is here, and their parents are here. It feels really serious. It's like the stakes have risen in a really, really compelling way. It's like, oh shit, like, this never happened in the comics. Search and rescue says that they couldn't find him, and that their best guess is that he somehow hiked up the mountain. I don't know what to make of this, he says. And yeah, the search and rescue is here. That's the point of this. Calvin opened his eyes and stared sleepily around his surroundings. He sat up, yawned, and rubbed some sleep out of his eyes. Then he looked around in all directions. The box had landed in a heavily wooded area. There was a small trickle of water running down a small animal trail, and most of the trees blocked out the morning sunlight. Pine cones were falling all around them, and the chattering of an annoyed chipmunk reached Calvin's ears. It's a nice visual. I can picture it. Like, I'm there. Calvin checks the fuel gauge on the front control panel of the time machine, and it's apparently on empty. What the time machine runs on, because I kind of figured it just kind of didn't need fuel, I'm not sure it's going to be explained, but I'm curious. I'm curious if it is. If it is, I would love to find out what it uses. Calvin gets out of the box, he looks around, he's lost. He doesn't know where he is. There's just trees in every direction. It's weird. There was a long moment of silence, so longer than usual. Calvin rubbed the back of his neck. He began. You got us lost, didn't you? Hobbes asked, turning to his companion. Well, lost is such a strong word, Calvin began. How about marooned? Calvin pulls out a compass and he says that they should head northward. They start walking. I imagine that they've put the cardboard box back into the duffel bag. They keep walking. They think that they have an idea of where to go, and it soon becomes very clear they don't. Everywhere they looked was just giant mountains stretching out for miles. Miles and miles of snow-capped and/or forest-filled mountains. There was no sign of Camp Pine. No sign of any search and rescue helicopters or units. No sign of any clearing at all. Calvin and Hobbes were in the middle of nowhere. Thus ends Chapter 6. Chapter 7 is next and is titled Campsite. We cut back briefly to search and rescue. They can't find him. All they could find were footprints leading into the forest, and then they all of a sudden stop. And then one of the search and rescue people is like, unless your boy can fly, I can't imagine how he got away after the footprints stopped. And well, that is basically what happened. A whole day has passed by this point. Still no luck. For all everyone knew, the narrator says, Calvin, his duffel bag, all his belongings, and his small stuffed tiger Hobbes, say hello again, Hobbes, had disappeared right off the face of the earth. Page break line. Calvin kicked the cardboard box. Stupid time machine, he cried, throwing his fists at the box. How are we supposed to disappear off the face of the earth with this thing? Why exactly would we want to do that in the first place, he asked, sitting on a log next to a warm campfire. Calvin, conveniently, had packed an entire 3-person tent into his duffel bag, and with it a small camping oven and a bag of marshmallows. Also, Calvin had hooked a generator up to a bunch of light stands, had stationed them on every side of the forest, and was shining them forward as to see everything within a 1-mile radius. When Hobbes asked about this, Calvin said that he had raided Dad's work shed. Calvin glared at him. Well, why do you think, he demanded, we're trying to hide from whatever that was that we saw last night? I thought we were done with that, Hobbes said. I thought we were trying to get back to the campsite now. Sure, but not by night. Now shut up while I try and find a way to refuel this. Calvin turned back to the time machine. Calvin works on it for a bit, and then suddenly Calvin yanked open a compartment on the box and a loud cloud of black burst from it. Block! Calvin screamed, wheeling backwards from the smog. Curse you, low-budget time box! Hobbes rolled his eyes. He let the smoke and dust clear, and then he stood up and yawned and stretched. Well, Calvin, if it's all the same to you, I'm going to turn in for the night. Calvin looked up, the entire front part of him covered in black soot. Fine, he grumbled. Good night. Calvin muttered to himself, then turned back to the time machine, holding a screwdriver and a hammer. Neither Calvin nor Hobbes noticed the black shadow moving through the trees, slowly toward them. Well, I can't fix it, Calvin grumbled, throwing the box aside. Maybe now would be a good time to start working on another invention of mine. Zzz, Hobbes replied from the tent. Calvin glared at him and walked over to his duffel bag. He riffled through all the junk he had in it and finally pulled out a small circular device. It was a chrome portable CD player with a red stripe going around it. Here we are, Calvin said. He walked over to the campfire and sat down. It's a wonder I managed to get Dad to buy this for me. You don't need a CD player, Calvin. You already have a tape player. It even records your voice. That's more than we possibly need, Calvin grumbled to himself and opened the CD player up. He took a screwdriver and inserted it into where the CD would go and began fiddling around with it. Now remember this CD player. It is Chekhov's CD player. Remember, Calvin makes inventions out of everyday household objects, like cardboard boxes, for example. Or, for another example, out of water pistols, like he did with his transmogrifier gun. And that seems to be what he's doing now. He's repurposing this CD player into something new. Incidentally, I don't think the picture of this is on the author's DeviantArt page anymore. He seems to have taken down some pictures, and that's fine. Like, I get that. But at one time, there was a picture of a red CD player with a stripe along it, like a physical one that it seemed that he actually owned, that this invention was based on. I just think that's kind of cute. He took a screwdriver and inserted it into where the CD would go and began fiddling around with it. Suddenly, he heard something only a few hundred feet away from him. Snap! Calvin looked up and stared into the darkness. He saw nothing out of the ordinary. You know, if I had this finished, you'd be in so much trouble right now, he shouted at the darkness, holding the CD player up. No reply came. Calvin muttered to himself and turned back to the CD player in his hands. Just then, he heard another sound. Rustle, rustle, snap, snap. Calvin's head jerked up. He looked all around the darkness of the forest. He stood up and held the CD player out in front of him like a weapon. Okay, I'll bite, he said, glaring at the forest. Who's there? There's a bit more back and forth. He just keeps yelling at this thing, whatever it is. And then he turns around and he realizes that whatever this thing is, it's gotten behind him, and it's a large brown bear. Calvin screams, waking up Hobbes, and Calvin begins backing up as the bear approaches, glaring at him dangerously. The bear makes a swipe at Calvin. We got some real, actual peril now. Ah, Calvin screamed, ducking and making a dive for the tent. He rushed inside and frantically zipped it up. I would not... Look, I don't know what proper bear safety is, at all, but I wouldn't have done that. The bear seems to have briefly lost interest in him, and I guess Calvin left his duffel bag outside, and it seems to be pawing at that now instead. Hey, you can't get in there, he shrieked. That's my food, Calvin shrieked. The bear then ignores him, and this is when Calvin reaches into his pocket. Switching to plan B then, he growled. He pulled out a small TV remote control from his pocket and hit the power on button. Suddenly, to the bear's surprise, the duffel bag unzipped itself and opened up widely. An electric blue light burst from the bag, shooting straight upward into the sky, lighting up the night. The bear leaned over and stared inside. There was an intensely bright and colorful swirling vortex inside the bag. Several items which Calvin had packed were flying all around it, and there was a heavy wind going through it. Calvin turned and started turning the volume control up. Then he pushed the channel up button. Suddenly, air began getting sucked inside the bag. As if a giant fan had been turned on, items started being pulled into it. The generator, the lights, the campfire, and the various comic books Calvin had strewn on the ground. He zipped the tent back up and prepared. The tent began shaking. Hobbes was tossed off of his feet as suddenly the tent was ripped off of the ground. The bear watched in shock as the green tent rocketed through the air and was absorbed into the duffel bag. After the entire tent had been absorbed, the bag zipped itself back up and began shaking. There was a large blast of light, and the bag imploded into a large blue sphere about the size of a fingernail. It fell to the ground, and then silence filled the area. The bears stared at the duffel bag for a long time, shocked at what had happened. Then it looked over its shoulders, stared at the duffel bag again, then turned and waddled away. After a moment, the bag expanded outward again and flew open once more. Everything was instantly replaced exactly to where it was before. The bag then zipped back up and remained silent. Calvin peeked out of the tent. "Well there, that worked," he grinned. He marched out of the tent, grinning. "Let's never do that again," he groaned, collapsing onto the ground in a heap. "Oh, you have no sense of adventure," Calvin sniffed. Hobbes glared at him. Neither of them got much sleep that night. So it seems that his hypercube, or his pseudo-hypercube, because it's not a hypercube yet, it's just a duffel bag, it's got like a suction function and like a return everything to inventory function. And he used that to swoop everything back into the box, including he and Hobbes, because they were in the tent. And I guess that's a protection of sort. Anyhow, I think that's going to be it for today. I shall continue filming soon. Okay, so we've moved from my desk to my bed. This may be better in the long run, although if I do film here, I might have to like decorate the walls or do something. But you know what? I'm getting ahead of myself. Chapter 8 is titled Lost Civilization. Several days went by. Calvin and Hobbes had come no closer to returning to Camp Pine, and the search and rescue units had not come closer to finding Calvin and Hobbes yet. John and Earl strolled side by side through Camp Pine. The entire place was lined with police tape, and there were search and rescue units around the area doing whatever it is search and rescue units do when they're not searching for the lost person. John and Earl glared at them all from under their dark sunglasses and headed towards the counselor's cabin. John opened the door and Earl walked inside first. John gave the people outside one last glance before closing the door behind him. Earl groaned and walked over to the desk in the far corner of the cabin. "I can't believe this is happening," he griped, collapsing into the chair. "All of our plans down the tube." "Nobody said it was going to be easy," John said, crossing his arms. "We obviously need a new plan of action. By the way, where's the crew?" "How am I supposed to know?" Earl groaned. "They're somewhere around here playing Monopoly or something. How's our power situation?" John held up his arm, as if checking his watch. He pushed several buttons on it, making it beep repeatedly, and looked up. "We need to recharge," he said quietly. "We've been stuck like this for over a week now." Earl nodded. He turned in the chair and opened one of the drawers in the desk. There was a large blue button right in the middle of the drawer's floor, but other than that, there was nothing else in it. So it's just a drawer with a button. I love that. It's so silly. I love it. Suddenly, a monotone robotic voice chimed through the cabin. "Holographic disguise unit deactivated." Without warning, the locks on the front and back doors clicked and all the shades were drawn. Earl closed the drawer. Suddenly, something in John and Earl's white Camp Pine t-shirts began whirring. It started out slowly and softly at first, but soon it began to speed up and get louder. Suddenly, John's facial features began to melt away. The same thing happened to Earl. As if they were candle wax in a microwave, everything began to melt off of John and Earl, revealing something. I love that. I love candle wax in a microwave. I don't know, that's good. Points to y'all for that. John's fingers snapped together and fused. Earl's head began taking on a crescent moon shape. John's Camp Pine uniform began gradually fading into a bright red uniform instead. John, Chill, and Earl were not human. But you've probably already surmised that by now. Well, to be fair, I did spoil that within minutes of starting to read the story, if memory serves, so yeah, I don't think anyone watching this video at least is surprised, and I'm assuming anyone who was reading this at the time was completely unsurprised as well. "We didn't have to take this long at all the other planets we attacked," Earl complained in a more raspy hacksaw voice than before, leaning forward in his seat. I'm not sure I'll be able to do that without, like, accidentally bringing up some phlegm or something, so I'm not sure if I'm going to do that. "Seriously, how incredibly stupid can these humans be?" Earl groaned, burying his face in his tentacles. "Appointing kids to that kind of position? And I thought they were stupid when I heard they were still using DVDs." Rupert began pacing. So you're probably wondering what the hell they're talking about. People who know Calvin and Hobbes well and have a good memory of it may already know, but I don't know how many people like that are there out there, so just bear with me. "I would like to see the prisoners again," he said, finally. "Where are they?" Earl took his sunglasses off, also revealing compound eyes, and pushed another button in one of the desk drawers. There was another whirring sound, and suddenly part of the wall flipped over, revealing two armless figures with tall black hats. One of them had a star on their hat, and the other had a crescent moon. They were chained to the wall. "Hey, look! They want to talk to us again!" the one with the star on his hat cheered. "Oh, thank goodness," the other one said. "Conversation that isn't with you." Oh, okay, so earlier in this, I skipped over a sentence, but John's real name is Rupert. I thought that John sounded wrong. It's Rupert and Earl, who are for some reason he used a fake name in his fake alias, but so his name is Rupert now, and Rupert began pacing. Every other alien in this whose name is something like Lenny or Earl, that's actually their name, but for some reason his name is actually Rupert instead of John. Galaxoid and Nebular, Rupert said, pacing the floor in front of them. Yes, they both chimed. We have come here to Earth, searching for the supreme earthling potentate, Rupert said. Galaxoid and Nebular nodded. Okay, so context here. I think it was the final year of the strip, and they're going to explain this in a second, but I'm just going to give context because since you're not a fan of the strip in the same way that someone reading this would be, you probably don't understand. In one of the final years of the strip, there was a storyline where Calvin had to present a presentation about leaves, and he had to collect 50 leaves and show them off in like a notebook or something. He didn't want to do it, and he kept procrastinating, and then an alien spaceship landed, and they were all like, take me to your leader, and the two aliens who were in that spaceship were Galaxoid and Nebular. So Calvin ended up just claiming that he himself was the supreme Earth potentate, and that's what they call them, potentate. I've never heard the term potentate before outside of the strip and outside of this fic. Never heard it before. And so Calvin claimed that he was the ruler of Earth and that they used leaves for currency and that he wanted 50 alien leaves, and Galaxoid and Nebular were happy to provide them. And then when he presented them, everyone just thought that he took some regular maple leaves and cut them into weird shapes. That's all here to contextualize what we're about to get. We have come here to Earth searching for the supreme earthling potentate, Rupert said. Galaxoid and Nebular nodded. Through the information you gave us, we discovered that he was a 6-year-old living in an unnamed town in an unnamed state with 2 unnamed people, Earl said. It's true. Still funny, though. Galaxoid and Nebular nodded. Through a scan of that particular neighborhood, we discovered that he was attending an Earth activity called summer camp, Rupert said. Galaxoid and Nebular nodded again. We went through all this trouble just to get here, to capture the actual John Chill, pose as him, just to get close to the Earth potentate, only to have him disappear into thin air, Earl added. Galaxoid and Nebular nodded again. All because the crew goofed up and attacked him too early, Rupert growled. Now, we both need you to tell us. Rupert advanced over to the 2 aliens. Where did he go? Galaxoid and Nebular stared at Rupert. How are we supposed to know? Galaxoid demanded, his brow furrowing. You've done business with him in the past, Rupert said in a forced, calm voice. Okay, let me try that again. You've done business with him in the past. You traded 50 leaves from your backyard to him in exchange for the Earth. And then you gave him the Earth back for free after you found out about winter. Oh yeah, there was a follow-up to that storyline where they're just absolutely disgusted with the fact that it snows on planet Earth. Actually, we didn't give the Earth back until we found out about their movie. Manos the Hands of Fate, Nebular said. That's the second Manos the Hand of Fate reference in this fic. The master will be pleased. If you know, you know. Galaxoid nodded. And then there are all those Japanese cartoons, he added in terror. Galaxoid and Nebular both shuddered at the thought. What's wrong with anime, guys? Come on. Whatever, Earl said, rolling his eyes. The point is, you knew the SCP, the Supreme Earth Potentate. You understand him, so you will predict his actions. There was a moment of silence. Finally, Galaxoid and Nebular just shrugged, which is kind of weird to watch, considering they didn't have any shoulders. Rupert and Earl slapped their foreheads. If you can't tell us anything else, then we don't need you anymore, Rupert growled dangerously. He shot a glance at Earl, and Galaxoid and Nebular gulped. Earl reached over and flipped a switch on his uniform. Electricity suddenly began surrounding the wall that Galaxoid and Nebular were strapped to. They both closed their eyes, gritted their teeth, and waited. Suddenly, the computer voice rang out again. Electric shock unit missing or deactivated. Awaiting further info. Rupert and Earl stared ahead blankly. Earl smacked his sharp tongue against the roof of his mouth. The crew, he said simply. Rupert nodded. So Rupert and Earl are the leaders of this gang of aliens, and their crew is just... It seems like everyone else in their species is just an idiot. And that's kind of the joke that's been going on here. Well, we're the only ones that will play charades with them, Galaxoid said. Earl glared at them and pushed another button on his suit. The wall flipped back over and closed Galaxoid and Nebular up again. Now what? Rupert asked, turning to Earl. Those two are our last chance, and they can't tell us anything else. There's only one thing we can do, Earl said, standing up. Are our disguise units recharged? Rupert checked the watch on his tentacle. Watch on his tentacle. I'm trying to imagine that. Like, it feels weird. I don't know. Something about, like, a tentacle having a watch or, like, any kind of wristband feels off to me. I don't know why. Yes, they are. I'll reactivate them. He pushed a button on his suit and waited. The computer voice rang out once again. Alternate species, projector activated, it said. Holographic Homo sapiens form engaged. So they turn back, and then they push a button on the desk. The narrator notes that even though that the rest of their bodies are able to transform into this disguise, their compound yellow eyes remain looking exactly the same, hence why they're all wearing sunglasses, to try and hide it. Earl pushed a button on the desk. Teleportation activated. All crew members are to report. Brazap. Suddenly, Dave, Alex, Zach, and the rest of the counselors appeared out of thin air in the cabin. Only they were now out of their human disguises and in the form as the chrome-colored aliens. It was slightly creepy since they all had insane grins on their faces. Look at that. See? Is this comforting, everyone? Are we having a good time? I had such a soothing smile. That's how I imagine it. You ever see a mutant, dangerous creature with compound eyes and razor-sharp teeth possessing a stupid grin? It's weird, I can tell you that. They all looked around confused, and then spotted Rupert and Earl glaring at them with their insect-like eyes. Dave grinned. Oh, hi! We were just playing stand around in a large group and act like we're watching TV, he said. Zach wanted to watch Imaginary Nickelodeon, and Lenny wanted Imaginary Cartoon Network, but then I went on to... Shut up, Earl growled, grabbing a pair of sunglasses off of his desk and putting them on. We're resorting to our backup plan, Earl said, turning back to the crew. There was a moment of silence. Several pairs of blank expressions met Rupert and Earl. Rupert heaved a deep sigh. Do you even know what our backup plan is? He groaned. There was another moment of silence. Alfred and Alex exchanged nervous glances and Lenny's attention wandered to a butterfly fluttering by the now open window. Rupert and Earl groaned, loudly. Urgh. Never mind, let's just get back to the mothership, Earl grumbled. He pushed another button on the cabin's desk and the computer voice rang out one last time. Teleportation activated. Brazap. There was an explosion of electricity, and suddenly Earl, Rupert, and the entire crew of aliens vanished into thin air. Let's see, we cut back to Calvin and the Hobbes. They're still lost. The hours cut by, and soon darkness had come. They were forced to stop for the night. They're just wandering. I'm surprised they've lasted as long as they have. So, long story short, they set up for camp for the night, and then Calvin goes wandering off, and he stumbles into a trap. He falls into a pit, and then Hobbes tries finding him and also ends up falling into a pit. Calvin, Hobbes said suddenly. Yes, we seem to have just fallen through a hidden tunnel into a secret passageway, Hobbes said. So I guess it's not a trap, it's just that the ground was maybe a bit weaker than it should have been. Yes, we have, Calvin nodded, rubbing his chin. He turned back to Hobbes. Point being... Hobbes rolled his eyes and stood up, dusting himself off. So, all obvious stuff aside, where actually are we as of this moment? Calvin asked, rubbing his hands together and looking around. Let's hurry up, I've got stuff to do. You're so weird, Hobbes muttered, rubbing his temple. Okay, so they start investigating. Calvin thinks they've either entered a time vortex or into a hole down to the center of the Earth, which are certainly possibilities, I suppose. Calvin glared at Hobbes. Everything has to be logical for you, doesn't it? He growled. Don't even consider the possibilities that we're in the Twilight Zone or that we're going to run into the TARDIS at some point. Side note, the people who wrote this fic were massive Doctor Who fans. We're going to get another name drop of something from Doctor Who in just a moment in this chapter, I believe. They suddenly come upon a steel barrier that Calvin identifies as a door. They find a control panel, and Calvin deduces, based on this, that they must have just encountered a long-lost, technologically advanced civilization underground that has been hidden away from the world. That is not what they have encountered, by the way. Hobbes thinks it may be aliens, and, you know, considering the scene we just had, he's gonna be right. Surprise, surprise, I know. Okay, yada yada yada. So Calvin uses the transmogrifier gun and turns the control panel into a doorknob, and this somehow allows them to just open the door and just go right through. Calvin grinned. Hot dog, he shouted, rubbing his hands together, and without any hesitation at all, the 6-year-old rushed into the room, Hobbes staring at him uneasily, following after. That's the end of chapter 8. I guess the other Doctor Who reference is going to be in this chapter, probably. Chapter 9, incidentally, is titled Underground Passageway. So they walk in and they realize that the room they've entered into appears to be a very highly advanced-looking kitchen. Mechanical hands were sticking out of the wall, working with a kind of blood-red dough at a counter. Another machine had hammer-like devices on them and were currently pounding down onto something that looked like a dark green pizza without any toppings. That sounds gross. There was also a conveyor belt moving across the room. Lined up on it were hundreds of empty bottles. The bottles were moving underneath another machine, which was dripping electric blue pills into them. The belt would then take them through a hole in the wall and out of sight. There were, however, some basic appliances that gave away that it was a kitchen. There was a refrigerator in the left-hand corner and an advanced-looking microwave in the right-hand corner, which was sitting next to a high-tech oven. Calvin and Hobbes looked around the kitchen in shock. Hobbes picked up one of the bottles off of the conveyor belt as it passed and examined the label through the little light that was available. Oxygen adaptation tablets. Level 3. Hobbes blinked. He picked up another bottle off of the conveyor belt next to it. This one had a totally different label. Heat increaser tablets, level 7. Hobbes is still suspicious of all this. Calvin's still ecstatic that he's discovered the kitchen of an ancient civilization that he has now found. There's then a loud clang sound coming from elsewhere in whatever weird building they've entered. Calvin and Hobbes wheeled around. The piercing sound had come again. This time it had come from right behind the kitchen counter in the middle of the room. Calvin and Hobbes froze, staring at the spot behind the counter. Clang, 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 clang. Suddenly, a large shadow appeared around the counter. Calvin and Hobbes' eyes followed its progress as it loomed 6 feet into the air and stopped. It had a gelatinous form with tentacles and a sharp, crescent moon-shaped head. The tentacles were gripping something that resembled a pot and a wooden spoon. The curved head slowly turned, and a pair of yellow, glowing, compound eyes fixed onto Calvin. There was a small pause in which Calvin and Hobbes and the darkened figure stared at each other. And then, a reaction occurred. "Ah!" the two screamed, stumbling away from the alien. "Ha-ha!" the alien yelled triumphantly, moving forward. "You will be destroyed!" The alien advanced over Calvin and Hobbes, still holding the pot and spoon. "Run!" Zoom! There was a blur of orange and Hobbes suddenly vanished. There's been an ongoing joke I've kind of skimmed over where Hobbes is a coward and he can just escape out of anywhere at superhuman speed, and he ends up abandoning other people for safety multiple times in it. The alien stood in the middle of the darkened kitchen, staring after them. "How's my band going to get anywhere if no one gives me opinions on my music?" he whined. "I think You Will Be Destroyed is my best song." No comment from the narrator. If you didn't get that, he was banging a pot with a spoon because he thought it was music. He was trying to perform with all that. That's kind of funny. Calvin and Hobbes burst through the tunnel, attempting to find where they had come out. "Where's the exit?" Hobbes panted, throwing a glance over his shoulder. Calvin's head went from side to side. "It's, around..." Hobbes glared at him. "That was helpfully specific. Thank you," he said. "No problem." Suddenly, Hobbes made a detour and ran through an open door and... "Hobbes!" Calvin hissed, looking through the darkened room. "Where are you? Are you crazy?" So he wanders into the room that Hobbes is just ducked into, and he sees there's just a switch on the wall, and he decides to switch it on, and thankfully, it is a light switch. They start investigating the room, and they find a folder on a desk, which is labeled "Backup Plan, Top Secret, Please Store Safely." They end up finding a wall with a rack on it, which appears to have weapons hanging off of it. Hobbes has successfully deduced that these are aliens. We're dealing with aliens. Calvin is just happy for his part that there is a sonic screwdriver on the wall, hence the mention of Doctor Who that I said was going to come up in this chapter. Then he tosses it aside and starts looking at the other stuff. Calvin then plays around with another device that's on the wall, and they discover that it is actually a teleporter. "It's a pretty basic teleporter," Calvin said, examining it. "You need to know exactly where you're going or else it will just put you anywhere. I just ended up in the ceiling of the next room, luckily, but..." "So in other words, it can only take you places that you already know how to get to," Hobbes said, his brow furrowing. "Right," Calvin said. "Terrific. We're right back where we started," Hobbes sighed. "Not necessarily," Calvin said. "We can use this thing to get out of this weird place we're in right now." "Really?" Hobbes grinned hopefully. "Well then do it. Get me out of here." "Give me a second," Calvin growled, waving Hobbes off and walking over to the wall again. "Look, Hobbes, maybe we can find a fuel substance for the time machine," Calvin said. "Then we can get that working again, and we can get back that way. Plus, with the help of this teleporter, we can travel hundreds of miles in a nanosecond." Hobbes began whining and crying again. Poor guy. "Hobbes," Calvin growled. "Be nice, Calvin. Don't be a dick." The tiger sighed. "Oh, very well, but do hurry," he said. "Remember that we've got some disgusting mutated thing after us." "Righto," Calvin grinned, and with that he turned back to the wall. However, both he and Hobbes were unaware of something. Specifically that there was a security camera hanging on the wall behind them, staring right at them, the lens zooming in on them. The computer built inside it began working at full power. Words flashed across the screen as it sent several commands and signals out to the main control panel. I'm imagining it's another POV shot. "Intruder alert confirmed. Registered known physical appearance of the Supreme Earthling Potentate." The computer sent another command out to control panel. "Emergency extermination process engaged. All crew members are to evacuate. Underground observatory is closed. Evacuate, evacuate, evacuate. So maybe I should have explained this in a bit more detail, but Rupert and Earl think that Calvin is in charge of the planet because of Galaxoid and Nebular and their interaction with them. And as such, that's why they've come to this camp. I feel like that was obvious, but I'm just explaining it in case my reading somehow confused things. I don't know. That is what's going on here. They disguise themselves as the camp counselors to try and kidnap Calvin and to, I don't know, maybe hold him for ransom to get the Earth or to do something with him, which I like. I like this as a plot device. It's a really clever way of tying in pre-existing lore, and it gives them a reason to be searching for Calvin specifically, while still staying within the confines that the comic books presented. Chapter 10 is titled, The Earth Potentate. So, I suppose we underestimated this Earth leader, Rupert Chill said, folding his tentacles out in front of him. I don't think I've been consistent about his voice at all, but we're just gonna keep going with it. How the heck did he find our observatories? What I want to know, Earl said, glaring at the computer screen in front of him and Rupert. The whole purpose of this place was to find him before the Earth executives found him. The Earth executives. And he barges in before we get the faintest signal. He's a genius, Rupert said. We shouldn't have took him for a simple child. Look. The alien pointed his tentacle at the security monitor that had Calvin and Hobbes on it. That device he has, it's set to look like an Earth duffel bag, he said, tapping Calvin's blue bag. The computer detected extremely high levels of interdimensional energy coming from it. That's how he couldn't detect him. The energy canceled him out. That is some good old-fashioned Doctor Who technobabble, I have to say. Earl squinted his eyes at the screen and at the bag. Interdimensional energy, he growled. This planet hasn't even figured out how to seal up the hole in their ozone layer yet. How did this kid accomplish that? I think we actually have successfully closed the hole in the ozone layer, but editing David. If that's wrong, just put a correction here, just do a YouTube apology. I don't know how he did it, but he's clearly the most intelligent of his race, Rupert said. Look at this, Hobbes, Calvin said, turning around and facing the tiger, now holding another device. Apparently the aliens can see Hobbes as well, interestingly enough. Rupert and Earl looked down at the monitor. Hobbes leaned forward and stared at the thing in Calvin's hands. It was a black cylinder covered with buttons, flashing lights, and a rotating end. What is it? He asked. No clue, but when I push this button here, it makes a whirring sound and shows a swirly, squiggly thing, he grinned. So much for being the smartest on the planet. Rupert and Earl exchanged glances as Calvin pushed the button to demonstrate. Indeed, the machine did make a whirring sound, and a spiraling hologram of transparent colors appeared on the front. Hobbes stared at it. I don't know, I would personally describe it as a squiggly, wormy thing myself. Calvin rubbed his chin. Indeed, but look here at the swirliness in the thing. I'd say it definitely cancels out the worminess of it. True, but if you kind of squint, you might call it a turny, squirminess thing. But one mustn't leave out the clear twistiness of the thing, Calvin pointed out. But the twistiness is most defiantly overtaken by the wiggliness, Hobbes argued. I'm not sure if defiant is meant to be definite, or if that is the word they were going for. Calvin thought for a moment. Well, perhaps we should keep this one and continue the discussion of the different levels of squiggliness and swirliness for a bit later, he said finally. Quite, Hobbes nodded. Calvin pocketed the device and kept looking. Rupert and Earl stood there, staring at the screen for a long moment. Anyway, Rupert said, turning around, we have 5 minutes to get out of this place before the computer releases the poison gas through the halls. Calvin and Hobbes are going to get gassed to death, oh my god. We can't just leave him here, Earl growled, glaring at the monitor. We have to send someone out to get him. We don't have time, Rupert said. Besides, there's no way he can survive this system. He won't even know about it until it's too late. We have to get the crew out of here, though, now. Or it'll kill them? Earl asked. Right, Rupert said. The two aliens looked over at a couch nearby. Lenny, Dave, Zach, and Biff were all sitting on it, staring at a television set with completely blank expressions on their face. Assuming there'll be any difference, Rupert added. Calvin is just finding even more inventions that are on the wall, and he just keeps dumping them into his duffel bag. He walks across the hall and ends up in front of a metal panel on the dirt wall. He grabbed a small device that looked like a knife from his pocket. He pushed a button on the knife. I almost said knife. The blade began glowing bright blue, and Calvin worked the blade through the panel and finally got it off. That sounds a bit, and by a bit, very vaguely, a bit like the sonic lance from Doctor Who. Only barely. I don't think that has a light at the end, but this is basically how it worked. If you're wondering what the sonic lance is, it's what the Sixth Doctor had instead of a sonic screwdriver. Colin Baker, aka my favorite Doctor, in case anyone was wondering. I don't know what Calvin's up to at this point, but He looks at a monitor that's also next to this control panel, and there's one word flashing across it, specifically the word evacuate, because of, the gas. Calvin went back to the monitor and pushed a button on it. Numbers flashed across the screen wildly. Calvin, do you know what you're doing? Hobbes asked, staring at him unsurely. Calvin glared at him. Hobbes, he said sternly, do you think I would just stumble through into something I don't understand? Hobbes stared at him. What do I look like? A bumbling fool? Of course I know what I'm doing, he declared. Well, what are you doing? Hobbes asked. Calvin looked back and forth between Hobbes and the monitor. I'm working, Hobbes, he said finally, and if you would climb up for a while, I would continue. Calvin then went back to the monitor. He's bullshitting this completely. He pushed another button and a small window popped up. Enter password. Calvin stared at it and he began typing. Calvin rocks. He pushed enter. Invalid password. Calvin's brow furrowed. Well, that's stupid, he said, crossing his arms. Suddenly, the password window closed and another window popped up. Calvin examined it. Intruder alert. Calvin stared at it. Oops, he said. Upon hearing that one word, Hobbes nearly had a heart attack. This is where they see extermination process activated, all crew members evacuate, all that stuff. Calvin starts typing again. He tries go away. That doesn't work either. Then he tries Calvin rules instead of Calvin rocks, and it does not work. Invalid password. Extermination process engaged. Hobbes is just in full-blown panic mode, and Calvin's just like, calm down. We've got a teleporter. Let's just use it. He tries and sets the coordinates, and there's a blast of light, and suddenly they vanish. Zap! Suddenly there was another blast of blue light, and Calvin and Hobbes reappeared about 7 feet away from where they were standing before. There we go, Calvin grinned, looking back. Back in the mountain range, completely safe. But then they look around and they realize that, though they've teleported out of the room, but they're still in a hallway in this observatory that they're in. And the teleporter's now out of battery. And so they start running. Darts deploy from like a panel in the wall, like just poison darts, and they have to dodge them. Eventually they come to what they're pretty sure is the exit, the door that they came into. They find a ladder as well, and Calvin shoots up from the hole in the ground from whence he had fallen and drove into the bushes several feet away. I guess the secret tunnels didn't make the ground weaker, which caused them to fall. It was just a hole in the ground. There were little holes to lead up and down up from the secret tunnels. They start going through the stuff they found, and Hobbes wants to look at the folder that says backup plan that Calvin did take with him, thank God. Hobbes starts reading, as I said, and have you ever heard of a place called Zoc? Hobbes asked, looking up. Calvin looked up as well. Yeah, it's over by Los Angeles, isn't it? He asked. Hobbes shrugged and went back to the paper. There was another pause, and then he looked up again. How long have we had an Earth potentate? He asked. Calvin looked up again. A what? A potentate for the planet. How long have we had one of those? I'm afraid I missed that newscast, Calvin said. Where does it mention that? Right here, Hobbes said, pointing at a spot on the paper. Calvin walked up and read it. Should the potentate realize the main plan and begin evasive action, the objective is to immediately fall back onto the backup plan, in which members of the assassination should begin to have no further interaction with any other individuals in the area. He looked back up at Hobbes. Well, now we're getting somewhere. Some morons are planning to assassinate the Earth potentate. Now we just got to figure out who that is. They haven't really figured out that they might be talking about them, or about Calvin, I suppose, but give him a second. Calvin, we don't have an Earth potentate, Hobbes said. Oh, don't we? Who do you think runs this place anyways? Calvin demanded. Hobbes opened his mouth to speak, but then paused for a moment. Well, it's either the UN or Oprah. Calvin studied the paper. Evasive action. That kind of reminds me of that pale emo vampire kid from the Twilight movie. What? What was his name again? Eddie Collins, I think, Hobbes said. All right then, so we've stumbled onto the horrifying plan to assassinate Eddie Collins, Calvin said, straightening up. Eddie Collins is the name of my Collins Sona in Dark Shadows. Shout out to any viewers of my Dark Shadows video out there. What do we do about it? Calvin asked. And Hobbes groaned. Calvin, do you think maybe we should keep reading to see if any names pop up as opposed to just assuming it's the first person you think of? Anyways, Calvin just shuts up, and Hobbes keeps reading, and this is when it finally clicks. Hey, do you remember Galaxoid and Nebular? Calvin stared up at him. You mean the two aliens who called me the Earth potentate? Yeah, I remember them. Why? Do you suppose they have anything to do with this? Hobbes asked, and Calvin shook his head. No, we resolved that, remember? All they wanted to do was to incorporate Earth with their little collection of planets that they have on that big list back home. It's all for their egos, Hobbes. Isn't it kind of a coincidence that there's someone searching for an Earth potentate only a year or so from when we met Galaxoid and Nebular? Hobbes asked. Yeah, that is an odd paradox, but it's nothing to get all fussy about, Calvin said. The world is filled with nutwags like that, Hobbes. I happen to just know a few of them. And I can say they make Fox News look like a bunch of well-educated journalists. God, remember back when Fox News was just the furthest right-wing, newscast in America, and now we have Newsmax? God, it almost makes me miss those days. Hobbes sighed. Well, if you aren't worried about it, then I won't either, he said. That's the spirit, Calvin grinned, patting Hobbes on the back. Now let's get some sleep. I am beat. And with that, the boy crawled into his sleeping bag and closed his eyes. Hobbes took one more look at the folder and laid it down in his sleeping bag to get some sleep, throwing it aside to do so. Neither he nor Calvin noticed the photograph that fell out of the folder onto the ground of the tent. It was a family photo of Calvin, Hobbes, Mom, and Dad. End of chapter 10. Would be a better cliffhanger if we didn't already know that they were looking for Calvin specifically, but it's a nice moment anyways, respect. So that ends chapter 10. We now have 7 chapters left. I think I might be able to get this done in the next week and a half, actually. If so, that'd be great. Okay, so I have bought a little table I can move around that I can set my laptop on. And I've also gotten some extension cords so I can plug in my ring light. And I found my microphone. Still a work in progress, but we're getting there. Let's begin. I don't think I mentioned this at the start of the last chapter, but chapter 10 was titled The Earth Potentate, and we are now on to chapter 11, titled Surveillance Activity. So Calvin and Hobbes have escaped, and Rupert and Earl and all the aliens have teleported not to the space station, but to their spaceship up in orbit, to figure out what to do next. There's a lot of time spent in this chapter on the aliens just kind of doofing around. I can't recall if I mentioned this at the end of the last chapter, but apparently the base they were in self-destructed, so now it's just gone. This observatory they had on Earth was gone. And then Rupert and Earl get an idea. They realize that since Calvin has their tech that he stole from their base, they can track him because all of the tech they have has tracking devices embedded in it, so he should be a lot easier to find. What about the interdimensional energy from his bag? Rupert asks. I'll just put the command in to focus on any abnormal shifts in the dimension, Earl said. Now that he has our stuff, we can pinpoint his exact location right now. And with that, he pushed a red button on the console and looked up. A digital map of the Earth appeared on the screen. It then flew over to the United States and focused on a specific mountain range in Colorado. So, presumably, Camp Pine, and therefore the unnamed state that Calvin lives in, is either in Colorado or in a neighboring state. An insane grin started to creep up Rupert's face. There he is. The Colorado Rockies. Miles from Camp Pine. The search and rescue units aren't even looking in the right state. But we are, he said sinisterly, turning to Earl. Earl turned to Rupert then and grinned widely, showing his blade-sharp teeth. Yes, we are, he said. And with that, in order to keep up with the high demand for a cliché, Rupert and Earl burst out with insane laughter as the green light on the screen above them continued to blink on and off. Unfortunately, who was to come and ruin their moment was none other than Lenny, who peeked into the control room and looked around. Earl? He asked nervously. Rupert and Earl stopped laughing. What do you want? Earl demanded. Would you be sad if I told you I accidentally dropped the hyperdrive from our engine room and lost it? Lenny asked. Rupert and Earl stared at Lenny. Lenny, if you told me that, I would personally throw you off the ship into a herd of starving shadowfax, Earl said. Lenny paused. Oh, okay, he said. Never mind then. I think shadowfax might be a thing from Red Dwarf? Let me check. The only thing that comes up when I type in shadowfax, well, there are two things, actually. One is some character from the expanded Lord of the Rings mythos, and then the other one is a electric music band from the 70s. Huh. All right. Lenny paused. Oh, okay, he said. Never mind then. And with that, he simply left. Rupert and Earl stared at him for a long time, and then in the distance, Zach's voice was heard. Whoops, there goes the other one. Oh, God, Rupert groaned, his head falling to his chest. I'll call home and tell them to send a cargo ship, Earl sighed, turning back to his computer. And that's kind of all there is in Chapter 11. It's a pretty light chapter in terms of actual plot development. Elsewhere, Calvin and Hobbes are still hiking through the Rocky Mountains, and then Calvin remembers that he still has the ham radio that he had in his backpack at the very start that had that feedback, and they're like, oh yeah, we can use that. There was a tense moment of silence as Calvin and Hobbes stared at the radio, which was crackling silently. Finally, a female voice came from it. Welcome to Taco John's. You may look over the menu and order whenever you're ready." Silence filled the land. Calvin and Hobbes stared at the radio for a long moment. "What?" "The menu. What do you want to order?" the voice asked. Calvin paused. Nothing," he said, his brow furrowing. "Then what are you doing in the drive-up?" the voice demanded. "I'm not in the drive-up," Calvin spat. "Okay, then, where are you?" "I'm in the middle of a giant mountain range fiddling with a ham radio." A deep sigh came from over the radio. "Listen, kid, I don't have time for this. We're very busy today." "Oh yeah? Well, what do you expect me to do now?" Calvin demanded. "I'm lost in the middle of nowhere, and now I want a taco. What do you have to say for yourself?" There was a click, signaling that drive-up lady had disconnected from the radio. They play with the knobs on the radio again. They end up stumbling onto a man and a woman who are kind of flirting with each other over the radio for some reason. He talks to the two, and it takes them nowhere. The people on the other end said that they can't help them. They end up accidentally getting onto the radio frequency for the alien spaceship, apparently. Specifically, he gets a hold of Lenny, one of the aliens. "Okay, Lenny," Calvin said, preparing for a long explanation of the obvious. "Here is the situation. We're lost in the middle of the mountains. We don't want to be lost in the middle of the mountains. You need to go get John so that we won't be lost in the mountains anymore. Do you understand?" "Sort of," Lenny said. Calvin closed his eyes. "What do you mean, sort of?" "Well, I can't really go get John," Lenny said. "Oh, for the love of... Why not?" Calvin demanded. "Rupert won't let me talk to him," Lenny replied. Calvin thought about that. "Who's Rupert?" he asked finally. "I'm not supposed to tell you," Lenny said. "Why? He told me not to." "You gonna listen to everything Rupert tells you?" "If I don't, he yells at me." "I thought that was John," Hobbes said. "No, just Rupert and Earl. I've never talked to John." "Yes, you did, at Camp Pine," Calvin said, his brow furrowing. "No, that was Rupert." "No, that was John," Calvin said. "You know, big guy, beard, sunglasses, dog tags, any of this ringing a bell?" "I gotta say, Rupert's John Chill disguise sounds kinda sexy." "Yeah, that was Rupert," Lenny said. "He told us he was John," Calvin said. "Yeah, I think he said something about acting like he was called John," Lenny said. "Why?" "I'm not supposed to tell you." "Why not?" "Rupert told me not to." Calvin and Hobbes exchanged glances. Lenny?" Calvin said finally. "Yes, talking radio?" Lenny replied goofily. "Can I ask you one question?" "Okay," Lenny said, sounding as if he was grinning. "Where are you, right now?" There was a pause, as if Lenny was trying to figure that out himself, and finally he spoke. "Well, the crew and I are in the control room, and Rupert and Earl are getting their zappy thingamabobs." "What are you getting ready to do?" Calvin said, glaring at the radio. "Oh, we're gonna take over—" "Lenny, get over here!" Earl's angry voice suddenly came on. "Oops, Earl's yelling again," Lenny said. "He must want me to do something. Bye-bye, talking radio." And with that, the radio went dead. "Ugh," Calvin growled, ripping the headphones off. "This is hopeless. We're never going to get out of here." "Don't you think that conversation with Lenny was a bit odd?" Hobbes asked. Calvin thought. Maybe a little, but we have more important things on our hands, such as trying to figure out how to work this stupid ham radio." Calvin turned and kicked the radio angrily. It makes a bunch of staticky sounds. Hobbes freaks out, and then they just continue to set up camp like they were doing before. They're getting ready for bed, and this is when Hobbes says he hears something. Calvin does, actually. My mistake. My mistake. "What was that?" Calvin asked, looking up. "What was what?" Hobbes asked. "Did you just say something?" Calvin asked. "Nope," Hobbes said. "Oh, never mind then." And with that, they went back to work. Suddenly, Hobbes started hearing whispering. I guess they haven't gone to bed. They're still setting up camp. He looked up, and Calvin looked up. "Did you hear that?" "Yes," Calvin nodded. "Was that you?" "I was actually hoping it was you," Hobbes whimpered. Suddenly, Calvin and Hobbes started seeing more movement in the trees around them, and the whispering got louder. The duo looked around in shock, trying to locate what was cornering them, when as quickly as it began, the whispering and movement ceased. Calvin looked around in terror. "What was that?" he demanded. "Well, my best guess would be a bunch of whispering and random movements," Hobbes said. "Calvin," a voice came from the trees. The two of them whipped around. Out of the darkness, two figures approached them. One of them was tall and skinny with a big black beard. He was wearing dog tags and a white Camp Pine t-shirt. The other one was more muscularly built, sporting a bald head and a leather jacket. He too was wearing dog tags. I don't remember the dog tags being mentioned earlier. I don't know. Both of them were wearing black sunglasses. Calvin and Hobbes nearly fainted with relief. "John! Earl!" Calvin cried with glee. "I've never been so happy to see two creepy camp counselors. God does love me!" "Now, before you rescue me, I should tell you that I found an ancient civilization buried by years of torment and possibly the wrath of some vengeful god. I was going to report it to the media and become famous, but I think I accidentally made it blow up. So it's not going to work, unfortunately." The two of them stared at Calvin. "And another thing," Calvin said, starting to pace back and forth in front of them, "you need to increase your camp security a bit better. Those damn cameras you have all over the place did nothing to stop the undead zombie freaks from attacking me and driving me to escape into wherever the heck I am right now. Overall, I give your preparations for the nuclear or zombie apocalypse a D-. Now then, when do we go home?" "You don't," John said. "We don't what?" Hobbes said. "Get to go home," Earl said darkly. Calvin and Hobbes exchanged glances. "Why? Did the zombies take over?" he asked. John and Earl responded by holding up their ray guns and pointing them at Calvin and Hobbes. The duo stared at them. "Oh, I see," Calvin said, nodding in understanding. And then Calvin and Hobbes both vanished. Zoom! "Get them!" Rupert screamed, pointing after them. Suddenly, the aliens all leaped from their hiding places and raced after Calvin and Hobbes. Rupert pushed a button on his suit, and their human disguises melted away, their skin turning gray and their heads curving to take on the shape of a crescent moon. They then continued after them. Calvin and Hobbes leaped over bushes and logs, not daring to look behind them. Calvin's duffel bag was thrown over his shoulder and kind of holding him back as he struggled through the overgrowth. The aliens were not far behind, leaping off of trees and rocks, their yellow eyes glowing in the darkness. Well, they weren't exactly leaping off of the trees and rocks. I may take a moment now to point out that the only reason Calvin and Hobbes were staying in the lead was partly because the aliens were all a bunch of idiots, in that they would repeatedly run headfirst into the trees and boulders, trip over the rocks. A few of them were running in the wrong direction, and still more were getting tangled up in the bushes. It's pretty pathetic, actually. The narrator's got some opinions, I see. As per adventure story cliché number 556, they end up getting cornered at the edge of a cliff. One of the aliens grabs Calvin, is ready to throw them off the cliff, and then this is when Hobbes is like, "Let him go!" And the alien's like, "Okay," and lets him go. "Urgh!" Rupert screamed, clutching his face, like, "Urgh!" "Gasp! An ant!" Zach yelled, pointing at the ground. All of the crew rushed over to see. Rupert, Earl, Calvin, and Hobbes all stared blankly at the crew. Rupert and Earl sighed. "All right, well, we can just take him back to the ship and put them in the zoo as the last remaining human being alive or something," Earl said. "Agreed. Carl, take them to the ship, and ignore anything either one of them say." "Okay," Carl grinned, running over. "You know, this whole summer camp thing could have gone a heck of a lot better," Calvin said. "Keep in mind, Mo was the whole reason you came in the first place," Hobbes said. End of chapter 12. Next up is chapter 13, which is titled Rupert Chill. Swing 123 at this point, thanks Garfield Odie with assisting him with this chapter and the remainder of the story. After working on this one for 2 years, the goal is to finally wrap it up before January. I don't know when this chapter was published. I will say that, assuming that the final publication date on this is correct, it actually finished up in December. So, like, December 29th, so just a little bit before the start of January, so he actually got it all done on time, and I, for one, am very happy for him. Rupert and Earl had landed their ship in a small clearing on the other end of the forest. Calvin and Hobbes were led on by Carl and Biff. Okay, they try to, put him into, a corner of the room and then to turn on a force field to contain Calvin, but Calvin refuses to stand still. As a result of this ends up with one of the aliens trying to hold him in place, and then another one turning on the force field, thus trapping the alien holding Calvin in place as well. "Now I'm gonna see what Earl wants me to do," Carl said, hopping out of the room. "Me too," Zach grinned, following Carl to the door. Thump. The force field, unfortunately, was the equivalent of a standard brick wall, and Zach was unable to get out. He looked around his surroundings for a moment, and then a light came on his eyes. "Oh," he said finally. Calvin covered his eyes and shook his head. At that moment, Rupert walked into the room and placed his tentacles on the console. "So, Earth Potentate, I can see you have finally met your match this." He stopped. For a long time, he stared into the holding cell with a look of complete disbelief, and then he finally spoke. "Zach, what are you doing in there?" he asked calmly. Zach looked around. "I don't know," he said. Rupert dropped his head onto the console, causing a loud thump. Calvin and Zach watched, slightly worried about him. I would not be worried about him. I would just be scared that he might take his anger out on me. But you know what? I've never been kept prisoner against my will. Emphasis there being against my will, I should probably mention. Finally, he came up and pushed another button. There was a rumbling sound indicating a teleporter being activated, and Zach immediately disappeared from the cell and reappeared outside of it. "Now please get out of here," Rupert groaned. "Okay," Zach grinned, bouncing out of the room. Calvin and Rupert watched him go. For a moment, they both felt a sting of sympathy for the little weirdo. Hobbes, meanwhile, has been taken to another part of the ship, being led by two other stupid alien members of the crew named Dave and Tyrone. And Dave says that Earl wanted Hobbes to be experimented on. They just kind of stare at him and they're like, "We don't know what to do. We don't know how to experiment on someone." Finally, Tyrone turned to Dave. "Well, we could always just ask him what he's like," he shrugged. Dave's eyes brightened. "Tyrone, you're a genius," he shouted. Tyrone and Dave stared intently at Hobbes. "What are you like?" Dave said slowly. "Well, I get by, obviously," Hobbes replied. "I see," Tyrone said, sounding rather impressed. "How do you get by?" "Well, my good looks and charm have helped me out of a few times in the past. I once managed to get a rhinoceros to stand down by just telling him I knew Drew Carey." "Ooh," the two aliens said. Okay, so finally, we're going to have our little face-off between the leader of the aliens and Calvin. He looks Rupert up and down. "So, I take it you are the brains behind the operation," he said, raising an eyebrow. "Mind you, that's not something to be overly proud of." "Indeed, Earth Potentate," Rupert replied. "No doubt you are full of questions." "You're reading me like a book, pal. For starters, who are you? And a follow-up? What do you want?" "I am Rupert Chill." So you just changed your first name? How original. The real John Chill has been disposed." "Ah, so John Chill is a real person, and you've just done away with him for now." "Correct." Calvin thought about this. "So, wait, your last name is Chill?" "Yes." "Was it already Chill?" "Yes." "Well, this is getting a bit surreal. How did that work out?" "You will never live to learn the truth." Ooh, spooky. Just wait till we go to series. I think that the actual human John Chill does show up in the Calvin the Hobbes the series fanfics, but I can't remember. It's been a number of years, as I've said a few times now. "We plan to destroy you and take over your government." "Do you indeed? How very, very quaint of you." "You are the one thing that stands in the way of total conquest." "Am I? How's that?" "Don't be coy. You're the supreme Earth Potentate." There was a pause as Calvin ingested this information. Then he remembered the files that he and Hobbes had found before. "Oh," he said, as if a little light bulb had appeared above his head. Rupert gave a nod. "Our next step is to take out the next layer of government. All the world's leaders and armies shall be taken down. We must not delay. We'll leave you here until we've decided what to do with you." And with that, Rupert vanished from the cell and reappeared on the other side of the force field. Calvin ran over and started pounding on the force field wall. "Wait a minute, come back here. I'm not the Earth Potentate. I'm pretty sure one doesn't even exist." "We have our information, and there is nothing you can do. Good day to you, sir." And with that, Rupert slithered out of the room. I always have a hard time picturing these aliens. Like, they've got tentacles, but they slither, so maybe they got tails too. They got like a weird crescent shape. I'm trying to figure out, like, are the compound eyes on the tops of, like, the points of the crescent moon, or are they just kind of central, like on a normal face? I don't know. This is the kind of thing that I wonder about. If the authors of this are watching, which I'd be surprised, but if they are, do let me know below, because I feel like I'm missing something. The room he's in is super dark, and he hears a noise. "Out with it now. Speak, or prepare yourselves for a severe butt-kicking," he says. No reply. Calvin growled and held up his fists. "Okay, I've given fair warning. Feel the wrath of Calvin, boy of destiny." Just as he was about to go into his little windmill routine, a familiar voice reverberated from the dark corner of the cell. "See, it is him." Calvin stopped, his brow furrowing. "Wait, who's there? You sound familiar." "Earth Potentate, it is us." Calvin's eyes widened slightly as two familiar aliens came out of the shadows. Small gray bodies, no arms, stubby tentacles, large cone-shaped hats with designs, and single eyes slammed into the middle of their heads. "Galaxoid and Nebular?" he asked, stunned. "Hey, if it isn't the nice boy who gave us his winter coats," Nebular said cheerfully. You mean our Christmas stockings, Calvin replied, still bitter over the fact. Yeah, so in that storyline where they discovered about winter, Hobbes gives Galaxord and Nebular their Christmas stockings to wear over their bodies to keep them warm, and they're like, yes, this is very toasty indeed. Thank you, Earth Potentate's assistant, or whatever. You guys told him I'm the Earth Potentate, he cried. Hey, we would have kept quiet, but after 5 weeks it was all there was to talk about, Galaxord said with a shrug. We burned through 68 board games, Nebular said with a nod. Calvin stared at them in disbelief. Galaxord and Nebular realized he must have been angry, so they smiled innocently. So, how have you been? Calvin rubbed his eyes tiredly. Right, he said with a sigh. So how's it been going on your planet? How'd it go over with that mad scientist I unloaded on you? Okay, I'll explain this in a second, to the best of my ability. Galaxord and Nebular exchanged glances. Not bad, Galaxoid said, sounding uncomfortable. He's interesting, Nebular said with a nod. Okay, so here's the thing about Swing 123 and Garfield Odie. Both of them separately wrote their own ideas for Calvin and Hobbes movies, what they wanted them to be like. I'm assuming that because this is something that they both were doing at around the same time, they ended up connecting and they began working as co-writers. So this mention of a mad scientist who Calvin left on Galaxord and Nebular's planet is a reference, I believe, to the Garfield Odie fanfic, Calvin and Hobbes, Can You Imagine That? I've never actually read this fic. I actually haven't read a lot of the stuff that Garfield or Odie wrote on his own, but in it there was a mad scientist character whose name currently escapes me, which is unfortunate because he does come back in the series later. He's not the only mad scientist in the series either, but he built something called the Imagination Machine in that fic, and I guess it ended with him being sent to Galaxord and Nebular's planet. Kind of nice and clever of Garfield Odie to slide some continuity in from his own fic into this one. And I think he also rewrote his version of Can You Imagine That? So maybe that's something I should give a look at some point. Okay, so Galaxord and Nebular explained that they were flying about one day and they were intercepted by the Zokians, or the Zokians, I should say. That is the name of the aliens who are trying to take over the Earth. They are described as an evil race bent on universal dominance, and Rupert Trill is their king, and that he's already taken over hundreds of other planets and made them to bend to his will. Hundreds? Galaxord and Nebular exchanged glances again. Well, tens, Nebular said feebly. I mean, that's nothing to sneeze at. Galaxoid continued. He's been looking to take over a planet in this galaxy, and this is the only colonized planet in the neighborhood. So he immediately looked for a way to make it his. And he saw that some outsiders had contact with my planet and went after you, Calvin said, looking at the ceiling now. Yes. Fortunately, before he crashed our shuttle, we were able to destroy our black box and home base coordinates so they couldn't find our home planet. Good work. Unfortunately, we also lost our fuzzy dice. There's some good jokes in here. Calvin's been staring at the ceiling for a majority of this conversation, and they want to know why. And this is when they see that there's a rather large pipe running along the ceiling directly above the control panel, and that this pipe ran through the hatchway and into their cell. And Calvin grins at this. Elsewhere, Hobbes is still getting experimented on. Tyrone and Dave held on to Hobbes' every word. So, after the nuclear bomb was defused, I grabbed onto the vine and swung away after the corporate spies, Hobbes was saying, rather enjoying himself. Wow! Dave exclaimed, practically jumping up and down with excitement. He's like, wow! It's a good thing I'm on like a bouncy bed. I can do a proper bounce. I prowled around on all fours, a jungle cat in his element, using my keen sense of smell to seek out the criminals. Ooh, how exciting! Tyrone cried, wiggling happily. Finally, I managed to sneak up on them and corner them up against a rock. What did you do? What did you do? What did you do? Dave wailed. I ripped them apart with my claws and devoured them alive, Hobbes replied casually. Wow, 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 Tyrone cried. And that's what I did for breakfast. That's amazing. I finally know what I want from life, Tyrone said, a faraway look in his compound eyes. What's that? I want to become a professional runner. I'm going back to Zoc to take up the sport. Hobbes' brow furrowed, but decided to ignore the fact that Tyrone had actually no feet upon which to run. Okay, so they must slither around like snakes, or maybe they have tentacles instead of regular feet. Let's go. I'll get a shuttle now. And with that, Tyrone and Dave fled the room with much excitement. Hobbes watched them go. Slick as a slab of Canadian bacon, he muttered. And with that, he left the room and headed back the way they'd come with the hopes of locating Calvin. Calvin managed to climb up the wall thanks to the smaller pipes forming a ladder up to it. He gripped them as tightly as he could and reached into his hair. "What are you doing?" Galaxoid asked. "I just need to get this pipe to collapse," Calvin replied, still rooting through his hair. "No, I mean, what are you doing with your hair?" Calvin replied by pulling a whole screwdriver out of his haircut. Galaxoid and Nebular stared. "How'd you do that?" Nebular cried. "Oh, I sometimes store items in there. I once hid a whole banana so I could throw the peel in front of Susie during recess. That's gross, my dude. No prank is worth that." With that, Calvin applied the screwdriver to the side of the pipe, unscrewing the screws that held it in place. "Why do you need the pipe to collapse?" Nebular asked. "I just need it to collapse on the outside." "Why on the outside?" "Take a gander at what's beneath it." Galaxoid and Nebular stole a glance at the pipe outside the cell and saw the control panel was right beneath it. "Oh," they said. And bang on cue, Calvin managed to finish unscrewing the screws, the pipe letting out a creak and groan as it collapsed right over the control panel. Smash! The control panel exploded in a shower of sparks and twisted metal, which bounced off the surface of the force field. "Yeah," Calvin said triumphantly. "That's what I'm talking about." "Quickly," Galaxoid said. "We must flee." "Lead the way." Galaxoid and Nebular fled the room, and Calvin re-hit his screwdriver and fled after them. End of chapter 13. We have 4 chapters left. There is a bonus chapter. I think I alluded to that in the last filming day that I did, but we're going to skip it. There's nothing in it that's actually plot relevant. Yeah, but I'm excited. So I shall see you all soon. Chapter 14 is titled The Plan. "All right," Rupert said, crossing his tentacles and overseeing the aliens before him. They were once again in the control room, and the crew were all seated around the giant console before them. "The Earth Potentate has been contained. Our next mission will be a little harder. We need to take down the United States President and Army. It's your job to figure out who these people are," Earl said, jabbing his tentacle at the crew. "Find them before 3 o'clock. The aliens all nodded eagerly and whipped around to their respective computers and started typing. Ooh, I got someone," Biff yelled. "Her name is Oprah, and she has 1 million fans on Facebook." Rupert and Earl stared at the screen blankly. "That's a celebrity, Biff. She has nothing to do with what we're doing," Earl sighed. "Oh," Biff said, rather disappointed. "I found him!" Lance suddenly screamed with excitement, jumping up and down in his chair. Rupert and Earl came over and examined his screen. "Says right here," Lace said proudly, or Lance, "President of the United States." "Lace?" I think he keeps saying Lace, so it must be Lace. "Lace," Rupert said calmly. "Yeah," he grinned. "Thomas Jefferson died in 1826. "What year is this?" Lace asked. Rupert heaved a deep sigh. Calvin, Galaxoid, and Nebular, meanwhile, were having no trouble at all moving throughout the ship. Considering every single alien except for 2 didn't know that they were supposed to be locked up, they could freely walk past any of the crew members without any worry of being recaptured. "Alright, so what's the plan?" Nebular asked as they moved through the ship. "Well, first we need to find Hobbes. Then we need to find the breaker room and find a way to sabotage the ship. Following that, we'll nick one of their space jets and cruise back to Campine, where we will reveal their plan to the world." "Ingenious," Galaxoid grinned. "Yeah, well, I try," Calvin chuckled smugly. "You guys can have a third of the fortune I'm gonna make for saving the world." Galaxoid and Nebular shrugged as Calvin checked around another corner and continued on the way. Meanwhile, Hobbes has begun to crawl through the air vents to get around, and he's looking down through one of the vents, down onto 2 of the aliens watching SpongeBob. "Why isn't jellyfishing an Olympic sport?" Danny whined, wiping a tear from his eye. Oh, he's crying. "Why isn't jellyfishing an Olympic sport?" Danny whined, wiping a tear from his eye. "It's a terrible crime we will never be able to understand," Carl sobbed into his tentacles. Crawled past the 2 little freaks towards another air vent where he peered outside once again. It was the vent in the main control room where Rupert and Earl were searching for the President of the United States in the most unorganized way you can imagine. "Here's someone," Lenny called. Rupert and Earl looked at his screen. "Lenny, Scooby-Doo doesn't even exist," Earl yelled, starting to lose his patience. Lenny looked at Earl in horror. He doesn't?" he gasped. At this, all of the aliens started crying hysterically at the realization of the non-existence of their hero. Rupert and Earl groaned. "How about this one?" Zack sniffed pitifully, pointing at another screen. Rupert stared at him. "No, Zack, Cher is not the president." I like how they know who all these celebrities are, but they don't know who the president is. It's funny. Hobbes' eyes widened as he realized what the aliens were doing. Quickly, he crawled past the vent and searched for another one to crawl out of. Finally, he found one and kicked it open. After dusting himself off, he began pacing back and forth. He had to find Calvin, rescue him, and then warn him about what the aliens were planning to do. He stopped at that thought. He knew he would have to put up with Calvin complaining about him getting away before he did. That was not something he was looking forward to. Nonetheless, he had to find and alert him of the impending danger. He started down the hall towards the direction Calvin was taken. Calvin ends up asking one of the aliens for instructions to help him find Hobbes, and the alien's just like, oh yeah, he was taken over there. They round a corner, and this is right when they run into Hobbes. Thank goodness. There you are. First things first. Did you get away before I did? Hobbes stared at Calvin for a long time. No? He asked. Good. Everybody's happy, Calvin chuckled. So here's the plan. We're going to find the breaker room, disable the ship, grab a space jet, and fly back to Camp Pine. Any questions? Hobbes blinked. Good. Moving on. And with that, Calvin started off. Wait a minute, Hobbes yelled, standing back up. I need to tell you something. Plus, we have yet to figure out why these aliens have decided to attack us. Calvin stopped. Oh, I've already figured that out, he said. They think I'm the supreme earthling potentate. Oh, Hobbes said. I was just eavesdropping on John and Earl, and I overheard their plan now that we're supposedly captured. Calvin rubbed his chin. Sounds interesting. Continue. Right now, John and Earl, Rupert... Hobbes stopped. What? His name is Rupert Chill, not John Chill. Wait, all he did was change his first name? No, it always was Rupert Chill. There just conveniently happened to be a John Chill at this camp I was going to, which he captured and posed as. How does that work? Hobbes asked, his brow furrowing. I don't know. Weird, huh? Calvin said, shrugging. Very weird, Hobbes nodded. Anyway, Rupert, Earl, and his crew are all in the main control room right now, trying to figure out who the president is so they can go assassinate him and take out the U.S. Army next. Calvin's eyes burst open. A large grin spread across his face. He started shaking with excitement. Really? He grinned, holding his hands up to his face. Yeah, Hobbes said, although I must admit this is not the reaction I was expecting from you. Good Lord in heaven, this is great. That means we can go save him, just like in those action-y spy movies. We'll prove we're more competent than those other spy wannabe fools, and we'll be revered as heroes. And we'll have our own Wikipedia entries. I think they already do, technically, at least in our universe. I'm not too sure that's a good idea, Nebular said. Calvin stopped bouncing and his hopes dropped a little. Really? How come? Rupert and Earl are a force to be reckoned with, Galaxoid said. They have a bumbling crew, but they are still the most dangerous aliens in Andromeda. They live in Andromeda? Hobbes asked. I think so, Nebular said. Yeah, I was never good at geography, Galaxoid said. This isn't geography, Calvin said. There, you see, Galaxoid replied. Calvin and Hobbes rolled their eyes. The point is, you shouldn't try and mess with them. They're mean aliens, Nebular said. You should just get the space jets and then get out. Well, what's the point of that? Calvin demanded. As soon as they find out I've escaped, they're just going to come after me again. We need to figure out how to beat them and to get rid of them. Besides, we're the only two keeping those aliens from killing anyone else. Galaxoid and Nebular exchanged glances. Well, do what you want, but we want no part of it, Galaxoid said. So we're going to find the nearest space jet and to strike out for home. Calvin and Hobbes stared at them. We wish you luck with your endeavors, Nebular said. Calvin grinned. Yep, us too. See you later. And with that, Calvin and the alien saluted each other and went their separate ways. I thought Galaxoid and Nebular didn't have arms or hands. This was mentioned before, so how did they salute? I think they have like long tentacles, so maybe one of those was lifted up to like salute height? I don't know. Hobbes turned to Calvin. What if they're right, he asked. Calvin asked boredly, looking up at Hobbes. We don't know anything about these aliens, Hobbes said. Despite the crew holding them back, their plan has seemed pretty well executed so far. How do you know they weren't planning for us to escape just so they could get an excuse to kill us? Calvin thought for a moment. Frankly, anyone who's crazy enough to think that you're the Earth Potentate is not someone I particularly want to get the bad side of. This is, I think Hobbes is speaking here as well. At that point, Carl rounded a corner and started towards Calvin and Hobbes. Immediately, Hobbes jumped into his defense position and started hissing at Carl. The alien waved friendly and continued on his way. Hobbes stopped hissing. He watched Carl slithering away. He didn't even look back at them. Hobbes turned back to Calvin. You know, I think you might possibly be onto something, he said. Calvin chuckled. Thus ends Chapter 14. Next up is Chapter 15, titled Resignations, which I will begin after I get a cup of water. Okay. Rupert and Earl sat slumped in their chairs, watching the crew check the computers and then run over with excitement. Carl ran up. Okay, I think the president's name is Jack Daniels. That's an alcoholic beverage, Carl, Earl replied, not even looking at him. Zach ran up. I think his name is Jason Lee. That's a television actor, Zach, Earl replied. Lenny ran up. I think his name is Optimus Prime. He's a fictional dang toy. Really? His Wikipedia word count is bigger than that George Washington guy's. Who's George Washington? Rupert asked tiredly. Lenny checked his sheet of paper. It says here he was the first president ever in the world. I think he's dead now. Okay, so there's some more There's some more shenanigans. They seem to have finally figured out where the White House is, so that's something, I guess. And then we jump over to Galaxoid and Nebular. Outside, Galaxoid and Nebular had managed to escape. They were just drawing away from the ship when they noticed that the entire craft was changing shape. It changed from the sleek and cool spaceship to a deadly, gigantic battle cruiser. Twin laser cannons slithered out from the sides, aiming dangerously at the Earth. Galaxoid and Nebular stared at it for a few moments before they made a decision. "Yeah, we got out of there at the right time," Galaxoid said. "And how? Let's skedaddle," Nebular said. And their shuttle zoomed away. "Zero in on the White House," Rupert ordered. Lenny pressed some buttons and watched as his radar screen zoomed in on the White House, making several squares home in around it. Making several squares home and around it. So, like, the grid that's on the screen is homing in on it. "Got it on visual," he announced. "Get ready to destroy," Earl shouted. "Ready!" the crew yelled back. And just as the laser cannons were priming up and aiming at the target, clang, 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 everything stopped. "What was that?" Rupert asked, looking around. "Maybe the thing is loose," Alfred suggested. "What thing?" "You know, the thing. It makes the big thing work." Everyone stared at him confused. "Which big thing?" Earl asked. "You know." "No, I don't know." "You don't?" "I don't." "You sure?" "I'm sure." "Oh, then I don't know either." Clang, clang, clang. Rupert looked around, and that was when he saw what it was. Dave was at the door, pounding on it, wanting to be let in. He waved cheerfully at them. "Open the bulkhead," Rupert said with a sigh. Ernie pressed a button on his desk and the door slid open, allowing Dave to waltz inside, grinning helpfully. "Hi, everyone," he shouted. "Hi, Dave," they shouted back. "What are you doing here?" Rupert demanded. "You're supposed to be experimenting on the tiger." "And where's Tyrone?" Earl added. "Tyrone quit." "He what?" "Yeah, he said something about becoming a marathon runner." "So what about the tiger?" "It was the tiger's idea." "Ah." "Yeah, he told us about how he killed a thing with his bare hands, and then I went to say goodbye to Tyrone. He says he'll think of us fondly, by the way." "So where's the tiger?" Rupert demanded. "I don't know." Rupert and Earl growled. "You mean there's a possibility that he's loose?" Earl demanded. "I suppose. Should we have tied him up first?" "You fool! What if he gets to the Earth Potentate?" "Oh, don't worry. There's no danger in that." "How come?" "He escaped all on his lonesome." "What?" "Yeah, I passed that room on the way here. The pipe fell on the controls and the force field shut down. So yeah, he's not there anymore." Rupert growled loudly. "Oh, for the love of all that is putrid." Earl swung around in Ernie's direction. Ernie started a security scan. "Find the Earth Potentate." Ernie hit a button that sent a sweep down all the security cameras. A wall dropped away in the room, revealing another wall full of screens, each one receiving feedback from all the cameras. Rupert and Earl stared at them intently, scanning each one. "There they are," Earl exclaimed, pointing at one. The crackling and distorted vision of Calvin and Hobbes showed them running down a hallway. "They're heading for the main control room," he said. "Then we must stop them." "Zach! Chris!" Two aliens leapt from their seats and saluted stupidly. "Head them off at the past. Don't let them enter the main control room." "Are you excited?" "I'm excited." Calvin and Hobbes checked around a corner and looked down at the adjacent corridor before tearing off down it. "What's our plan exactly?" Hobbes asked. "Well, I figured that we can disable the main controls and cause this ship to crash." "We're going to make the ship crash?" "Yeah." "And that's the best way you can come up with?" "We'll make it crash on land so that we can make a quick getaway, that's all." "Is there a problem with that?" "Well, we're going to make it crash, yes, with us still on board? Yes?" "Well, maybe we'll find a way out of here first. Then we'll make it crash." "That's better." "Look, we won't hurt anyone. Come on, how crazy do you think I am?" "Apparently, I've never been able to completely pinpoint that particular figure. Interestingly, they just stopped using dialogue tags for a good chunk of this exchange, which is why I'm not mentioning who's saying what. They just stopped all of a sudden. I don't know, it's interesting. Oh, shut it, let's get a move on. They checked around another corner and ran down the next corridor. "How do we know where we are? Are you sure we're in the right place?" Calvin looked around until he spotted the next corridor. He saw two aliens heading for a giant door. "Okay, here we are at the giant control room," one of them said. "Hope we got here before the Earth Potentate did," said the other. Calvin and Hobbes looked at them in wonder. "Yeah, we're here," Calvin sighed. They approached the two aliens, who looked at them cluelessly. "Hello," they said together. "Hello," Calvin said charmingly. "Don't suppose either of you have names?" "I'm Zach." "And I'm Chris." "Glad to know you, Zach and Chris. What are you doing here?" "We're supposed to keep the Earth Potentate out," Zach explained. "Are you him?" Chris asked. "Nope, I haven't seen him anywhere. So that's the main control room, though, isn't it?" "Yep." "Do you know how any of those controls work?" "Nope." "Why not?" "Rupert said it was for the well-being of the ship," Zach said. "Smart," Hobbes said with a nod. "I don't suppose you'd let us past?" "Sorry, but we have our orders," Chris replied. Calvin stared at them for a moment, and then he began grinning. Page break line. Calvin and Hobbes entered the main control room proudly. "Nice work," Hobbes commented. "All I had to do was convince Chris to become a psychologist," Calvin said with a grin. "You never know what lurks beneath their idiotic exterior." Calvin and Hobbes looked around the room with interest. So I guess they just tricked them. We don't have details of how they were tricked, but they were tricked. The room was enormous. There was a network of gantries stretched above them. Banks of programming computers flashed multicolored screens in a horseshoe shape. Sheets of data spilled out of the many printers as new info came in from the decks below. Guys, that's wasteful. Come on. Go paper-free. Calvin and Hobbes zigzagged through a maze of towering columns of identical hard disk drives and various piles of papers. They finally approached a giant screen that had a long row of buttons on it. "What do we do now?" Hobbes asked. "We have to find some way of gaining access to the mainframe. Then we'll be able to get control of the steering," Calvin said, looking at the rows of screens. "And you know this how?" "Oh, I'm just winging it." Calvin sat down at one of the computer columns in its chair. He looked at the touchscreen in front of him. "Right," he said. He prodded the screen with his index finger, and it all stopped flashing and gave him a clear desktop. The words, "State Command," appeared on the screen. "Okay, I need access to the thing that steers the ship," he said. "Access denied," a smooth, polite voice replied. Maybe I should have worded it differently. How about access navigation?" Hobbes asked. "Access denied." "Access steering?" Calvin asked. "Access denied." Calvin rubbed his temples in annoyance. "This isn't going well." "No, it isn't," Hobbes said, leaning against his chair tiredly. "Maybe we should find another way." "Get them!" Calvin and Hobbes turned around in time to witness several tentacles fly in and wrap around their torsos, picking them both up effortlessly. "Hey!" Calvin shouted. "Help!" Hobbes wailed. But the aliens carried them away, taking them out of the room and towards Rupert and Earl, who were glowering at them in anger. "So, what's all this about two of our crew quitting?" Rupert growled, narrowing his compound eyes. Calvin grinned nervously. Job dissatisfaction?" So we cut to a bit later. They're both tied to chairs, someplace in the ship. They're discussing what to do with them. The crew, as usual, is being completely useless. They just continue to argue about what to do with them, and the crew and Rupert and Earl just leave the two of them alone. Actually, everyone leaves except for Earl, who is still here, and this is when Calvin's like, "So, fancy a field trip? I guess that's what we're doing right now, because we're flying someplace." "Looks like it," Hobbes replied. "Does anyone know the theme to Three's Company?" End of chapter 15. I didn't get it either. Okay, I took a break to eat and just refresh myself. I only recorded for 20 minutes earlier, so I think I can finish the fic today, which is very exciting. So chapter 16 is next, and is titled The Escape. The trip to the back of the ship, one may note, was a long one, considering it was the size of a small city. And so, in order to save crew members and sanity, Earl tied Calvin and Hobbes up and threw them in the back of a small hover car. He climbed into the front of the car and started it up. The small vehicle rose from the ground and took off down the hallway at a good 50 miles per hour. Unfortunately for Earl, he had forgotten one of the key elements for tying somebody up and taking them hostage: the gags. "This is an outrage to humanity," Calvin declared as Earl drove them down the hall. "I'll have you know, my dad is a lawyer. He's a dang patent attorney, for God's sake. You know not what you are toying with. And furthermore, what kind of idiot decides to take over the Earth at the very beginning of summer break? Have you no heart? You mean to tell me you couldn't have waited a lousy 3 months for school to let back in before you decided to barge in and disrupt my state of being?" Earl ignored him. Calvin paused for a moment as he thought about what to say next. "Your mother was gray, so there," he spat. Earl kept staring straight ahead and did not respond to what Calvin said. Calvin and Hobbes exchanged glances. Grins slowly spread across their faces. Immediately, Hobbes began chewing through the rope as Calvin continued. "And what's more, the ship is pathetic. You can't possibly tell me this thing managed to get all the way here from Zoc. I wouldn't drive this thing to the supermarket. And who the heck designed the godforsaken thing? Rick Sloan? I mean, come on. I wouldn't spit on this ship. Who is Rick Sloan?" Rick Sloan is okay. So, Rick Sloan is the name of a film director. He did a bunch of movies called Vice Academy. But he is mostly known as the director for Hobgoblins, which is another Mystery Science Theater 3000 movie. It was supposed to be a horror comedy that was like a Gremlins knockoff, and it's an experience, you guys. I'm not going to spend any more time on this. The reference doesn't make any more sense, although I will say another movie that Rick Sloan has apparently directed is called The Bikini Academy. So do with that information what you will. So Hobbes chews through the ropes on him and then on Calvin. Earl is just completely ignoring him as Calvin has just continued to rant and rave. And this is when Calvin leaps onto Earl. "Give me the wheel!" "Ugh!" Earl yelped, falling backward and trying to fight Calvin back. The hover car careened out of control as Calvin clawed and screamed at Earl, who helplessly fought back to no avail. Hobbes cowered in the back, covering his eyes, waiting for it to end. By some miracle, Calvin managed to kick Earl off of the hover car and grab the controls. They rounded a corner and vanished. Earl growled and grabbed a radio from his belt. Red alert, the Earth potentate is loose on the ship. Again. "Activate the defense system," he yelled into it. Meanwhile, on the other end of that radio, Calvin and Zach were sitting across from each other on the console playing Monopoly. Well, they had the Monopoly board in front of them, and they were moving their pieces across it. You couldn't deny that. Zach did, however, have 3 hotels on Boardwalk, despite the fact that he didn't own it, and Carl was chewing on one of the dice. Neither of them hurt Earl as they were too absorbed in playing the game wrong. They're flying through the ship now on the hover car. There's like an intruder alert, like voiceover coming on across the intercom of the ship. They're being shot at. Guns emerge from the wall and start shooting at them. Specifically, Calvin maneuvered the car through lasers, fire, and many other forms of destruction, miraculously getting through each one. The hover car exploded out of the spaceship and back into the mountain range. Okay, so I guess the spaceship must be in low orbit now. Like really low orbit, like not in orbit at all orbit. The car crashed into a patch of weeds which cushioned the fall, but nonetheless threw Calvin and Hobbes from it. Crash! Calvin and Hobbes landed a good 10 feet from the wreckage, conveniently landing in a patch of bushes which broke their fall. Calvin turned to Hobbes. "Alright, so would you say we're just kinda lost now, or have we entered the advanced lost stage yet?" Hobbes glared at Calvin. So they're now stumbling around. The aliens are coming after them, and so they hide in a small crevasse in the rocks nearby. And that's when suddenly a sound erupts from Calvin's duffel bag. Beep, 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 beep. "Oh God," Hobbes moaned. "No, don't worry, it's not going to explode," Calvin said, opening it up. "It's not that," Hobbes said. "I just can't believe you actually carried that around with you through all of this. I can't believe they didn't dispose of it, to be honest." Calvin rolled his eyes and shifted through all the junk until he located the source of the noise. "Hot dog!" Calvin shouted, a wide grin spreading across his face. "What?" Hobbes asked, leaning forward. Calvin rummaged through the bag more and managed to pull out the cardboard box. "It's recharged. We can use it to get out of here now." Hobbes stared at Calvin. "How long has it been charging?" he asked, his brow furrowing. Calvin shrugged. "I don't know, a few hours." "You mean to tell me all you needed to do is recharge it and we could have gotten out of here?" Hobbes demanded. "I thought that they knew this. Like, Calvin told them. I think the writers may have just forgotten their own continuity here a little bit. And there's no explanation of what charged it, which I was kind of hoping to find out, but oh well. Calvin nodded. "What shall we do with it?" "We go back in time and never go to Camp Pine," Hobbes said, as if it was the most obvious response. Calvin shook his head. "I'm afraid it doesn't work like that. There's too many complications to using time travel for that purpose. First, it would screw up the chain of events. Then we'd have to consider that there would be 2 of us at the same point in time. And then, of course, it wouldn't take us back home. And we'd be just right here at whatever point in time we set it at. Did you follow all that?" "No," Hobbes said. "I have a feeling you didn't either, so let's just get out of here." Agreed. Calvin and Hobbes shook hands, climbed into the box, and Calvin started the engine. As they are crawling into the box, the 2 aliens who were sent out to look for them, Zach and Carl, actually spot them and end up shooting at them, and actually does hit them as they're about to take off. Zzzt! Ugh! Calvin and Hobbes shouted, falling backwards. "What happened?" Hobbes yelled. "We're hit," Calvin shouted, leaping up and struggling with the controls. "I've lost the main control system. It activated the time brazzt." There was a bright flash of electricity, and the box vanished into thin air. Carl and Zach stared at the air where it had once floated. Carl looked at Zach. "Was that right?" he asked. Zach shrugged, and they just kept staring. "Well, I guess we can go back to our game now," Zach grinned. "Oh boy," Carl said, clapping his tentacles. "Are you still keeping score?" "Yep," Zach said as the 2 aliens turned and started slithering away. "I'm still ahead by 3 thimbles." This is the final chapter of Calvin and Hobbes, the movie rewritten by Swing 123 and Garfield Odie. I hope you're excited. It is titled MTM, and you'll see why in a moment. Swing 123 opens this up with an author's note. "Well, it's finally done. I started writing the story in February of 2007, and on this day, at the end of 2009, it has finally come to a close. With any luck, the story has been a vast improvement from the original one I wrote in 2005, and maybe possibly due to the fact I spent 2 years writing it in the first place, it has gotten better as it's gone along. Next order of business, I'm going to start Calvin and Hobbes 2 Lost at Sea rewritten sometime next year. I have a lovely new plot prepared for that one, and I plan to make it as different from the original as possible. Thank you all for bearing with me these 2 years I've spent on this ludicrous thing, and big thanks to Garfield Odie, who helped me in the completion of said thing. So I don't think Swing 123 actually did write a rewritten version of Calvin and Hobbes 2 Lost at Sea. I think years and years after the fact, like in 2012, his co-writer, Garfield Odie, ended up writing it on his own. Calvin and Hobbes found themselves flying backward through time. What happened? What's going on? Hobbes demanded, shielding his eyes from the bright colors of the vortex. Calvin had his own eyes covered as well. Avert your gaze, we're not wearing our vortex goggles. Soon, however, the colors stopped swirling and vanished, and before they knew it, the box was coming in for a landing. Calvin gripped the front of the box and struggled to regain control. Hang on, he shouted, aiming the box toward a level piece of ground. They came in for a rather bumpy landing, but otherwise, it ended safely. Where are we? Hobbes asked, scanning the terrain. Calvin started to check the time machine. That blast caused some sort of automatic safety mechanism to kick in. When the box came under attack, it pulled us back in time for protection. Oh, so their cardboard box time machine has a hostile action displacement system like the TARDIS does. The hostile action displacement system is a system in the TARDIS in Doctor Who, which I think has only ever been used on the TV show twice, maybe 3 times. Essentially, it's if the TARDIS detects danger in the area, it just immediately dematerializes and goes someplace else. This is a system that the Doctor usually leaves off, except for the handful of occasions where he's forgotten to, and essentially it's a way, at least in Doctor Who, for the TARDIS to disappear and to thus strand the main characters for at least part of the story. Here, it's just a way to send them back in time. And this is when Calvin realizes that they've only been thrown back a couple minutes in time, and they landed just a few feet away from where they took off from. Now's our chance to escape, Calvin announced. Get in. But won't they come looking for us? No, not just yet. They don't know the box is a time machine, so they'll probably think they destroyed it. So then what? Well, now we need to find some way of alerting them to the Earth's defenses. Their plan relies on going unnoticed, so they can weaken the Earth from within. If we reveal them to the world now, their plans are in ruins, and they can be destroyed. Are we sure the Earth can defeat the aliens? Well, Rupert and Earl are the only really dangerous ones. Once all of the others are gotten rid of, we can hand them over to the supposedly secret Area 51. Hobbes pondered all of this. Supposedly secret? Well, what else could they be? I suppose we could try it. Excellent. Now get in, Hobbes. We've got work to do. Hobbes jumped back into the box, which slowly rose into the air, kicking up dust as if it were a helicopter. This is it, Hobbes, Calvin said, drawing the box slowly forward. This is the big one. This is the stuff of legends. This is the place where heroes are born. Hobbes, I have a feeling this could be our finest hour. Hobbes thought about this. Well, except for that one time we managed to score a water balloon at the back of Susie's head from 50 paces. Oh yes, that was a piece of work, Calvin said, remembering fondly. And with that, they tore forwards and upward toward the spaceship. Here comes a moment I love. I don't know, it makes me laugh. Rupert and Earl stood in the main control room with a bunch of the other aliens, all of which were somehow able to activate all the controls and work them properly. Give me an ETA, Rupert ordered. We should be in the president's backyard in 2 hours, Carl said. This thing could never get decent mileage, Earl muttered. Sirs, incoming transmission, Lenny announced. Rupert and Earl looked confused for a moment. Put it on screen. The gigantic screen above them crackled with interference for a split second and soon changed, showing Calvin and the Hobbes grinning at them from outside the ship. Hey, Rupert, Calvin said mockingly with a grin. Then, sticking out their tongues and putting their thumbs in their ears, waving their fingers about, they said together, "Nya, nya, 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 nya." The screen went dead. Rupert and Earl stared at the screen in confusion before glaring at Zack and Carl, who shrugged in response. Biff checked his screens. They're heading back to that camp thingy, he announced. By the way, since all the aliens have regrouped, that means that, there are no camp counselors at Camp Pine right now. There's no camp counselors. It's just the kids and the search and rescue people and Calvin's parents. And I don't know for how long that's been the case. It's been probably a day, perhaps more? Rupert glared. Clever, Earth Potentate. Very clever, he hissed. Earl? Yes, sir, Earl asked, snapping a salute. Assemble some of your crew and get them on their jets. He's not getting away this time. Calvin and Hobbes held on for their lives as the box swerved through the forest. Trees flew by them at a breakneck speed. We got a chase scene. That's exciting. We're halfway back to civilization, Calvin announced, checking the blinking lights in the box. I guess now, the box is a GPS system and now they know where to go. Hobbes' acute hearing picked up the sound of some sort of motor. He checked over his shoulder and saw that 5 aliens were following them on hover scooters. We got some black barts coming up on our mud flaps, he announced. We got what? Calvin asked, looking back for himself, and that is when he saw the aliens. Oh, he said, darn it. I was hoping they'd just bring the whole spaceship. Oh well, let's just auger this baby in. Calvin and Hobbes aimed the box up and over the treetops, the aliens following in pursuit. The little box flew high into the air. Wow, Calvin said, looking around. Let's see if I can find Camp Pine from up here. The aliens came up from behind them, and Hobbes looked at them nervously. Perhaps we should consider putting some pedal to the metal. These guys look like they could catch up with us really easily. We just have to make it to Camp Pine. With any luck, there'll be some people there who can alert the National Armed Forces or whoever's running this quiz show. Then Calvin looked off into the distance and saw some smoke rising up out of a clearing. That's the chimney at the kitchen. There she blows, he cheered, aiming the box toward the camp. Finally, Hobbes cheered. The nightmare is nearly over. Suddenly, 2 aliens zoomed past them. The shockwaves bounced Calvin and Hobbes up and down madly in their seats. Whoa! They cried. Hey, watch where you're flying, you dang space hog, Calvin yelled. Maverick, Hobbes added. The 2 aliens managed to turn around and head straight for them. Now it was really intense. Oh, so that's how you want to play it, huh? Calvin sneered. And airspace gave him a chicken? Very well. Hobbes gulped and prayed for mercy. Calvin glared ahead at the 2 aliens who were both showing no signs of stopping anytime soon. In fact, they seem to be speeding up. You're sure about this, right? Hobbes asked hopefully. Hobbes, have I ever led you astray? Several times, yes. Oh, well, then this will be the exception. And with that, Calvin made the box swivel and sway from side to side. The aliens stupidly copied the motion and ended up bumping into each other, causing damage to their crafts, which in turn caused them to plummet and vanish, trailing twin streaks of black smoke, leaving Calvin and Hobbes flying safely onwards. The remaining 3 aliens continued chasing, growing closer and closer. Camp Pine loomed in the distance. We're nearly there, Calvin said. Another clear mile and we'll do it. Broom! Calvin and Hobbes stared at the control panel. All the lights were flashing. Calvin took note of a certain gauge. Oh, he said. What? I think we're running out of fuel. Hobbes stared at him. It's a box! Oh, what was I supposed to do? Gas up in Des Moines? I don't know how to say that. The box began to lose altitude. What do we do? Hobbes asked worriedly. I need to find a nice safe place to land, Calvin said. Someplace nearby. Can you see any place? Calvin scoured the area. His eyes lit up when he saw something below a row of trees and bushes. There's the racetrack, he cried. We can land in the middle there. It's a nice flat surface, and precisely what we need. Can you make it over the hedges? You bet! The box suddenly let out a horrific splutter and started vibrating, and soon they were dropping. It soon came down behind the rows of shrubbery, still moving very quickly. Okay, so maybe not, Calvin said with a shrug. Hobbes sighed to himself. On the racetrack, the search and rescue team were standing with Calvin's parents, some of the counselors, and a few of the kids, Susie and Mo included. I guess they must have left some of the counselors behind. Or maybe not all the counselors were aliens, I'm not sure which. They were wrapping up their explanations. And so I'm sorry, sir and ma'am, but I'm afraid that your son may very well be lost forever, the leader said. I'm truly sorry, we've done everything we can. Mom and Dad looked at each other, feeling tears creeping into their eyes. Susie was clutching Mr. Bunn in her hands, trying to stop the lump from rising in her throat. Mr. Bunn is Susie Durkins' own little, stuffed animal companion. Sure, there's no hope. Oh wait, I forgot. I voiced the mom so that she sounded like Taya from Yu-Gi-Oh! Abridged. So let me do that again. You're sure there's no hope? Mom asked sorrowfully. I'm sorry, ma'am, the leader said solemnly, but we've searched those hills high and low, and I'm afraid that your son is never coming back. Blam! Leaves and branches suddenly went flying, as up on the hilltop, trees and branches were pushed aside as a small cardboard box flew through the air and over their heads. It came in for a landing, bouncing and bucking for a few feet before it headed straight for Mo, knocking him over and landing on top of him. Everyone should have seen that. No one's gonna question it? I guess not. Oh! Mo shrieked. A head full of yellow spikes came up and shifted around the opening on the box before a pair of eyes came up as well, followed by a pair of marble eyes in the head of a stuffed tiger. Finally, Calvin came all the way out and looked around frantically before glaring at the tiger next to him. Oh, don't give me that look. It was inevitable. I got us back, didn't I? His companion offered no reply. He just sat there, looking innocently back. Calvin! Mom cried, running over and scooping her child out of the box and hugging him tightly. Aww. That's sweet. Makes me smile. Mom, hey, easy. I'm sore. But Mom wouldn't let go. Dad walked over with a stern look on his face. Calvin, do you have any idea what state your mother has been in since you've been away? He demanded angrily. I missed you too, Dad, Calvin retorted. This is why so many people have daddy issues, because that's how so many fathers would react in this kind of situation. My own included. Search and rescue leader came over. Calvin, are you okay? Who the heck are you? I'm with Search and Rescue, son. We've been looking for you. Calvin glared. Pah! Some Search and Rescue you turned out to be, for crying out loud. How long has it been? 2 weeks? The leader sighed heavily. Calvin, are you all right? Mom asked frantically, checking her son over. But Calvin wasn't paying any attention to her. Where are the aliens? He asked, mostly to himself. What? The aliens! They were following us. We ran out of fuel and landed here. They were gaining on us. Susie rolled her eyes. And here I was thinking you'd be different if you ever came back, she said, shaking her head. Hey, shut up, Durkins, you weren't there. You don't know the evils I faced. Now, where are they? Calvin waited and waited silently, and everyone was polite enough to stay quiet and listen, but no one came. Calvin sighed to himself. This so totally figures, he muttered. Then they heard the sound of the cabin door squeaking open, and they all looked and saw someone coming out of the counselor cabin. Calvin stared at him. It was Rupert Chill in his human disguise. Calvin stared at him in confusion. Wait a minute. How did you get back here before we did? He demanded. Calvin, what are you talking about? Dad asked. That guy has been chasing Hobbes and me throughout the woods on a spaceship, and he tried to torture us, and he has an alien crew who are a bunch of Nimrods, and he trailed off when he noticed that Rupert Chill was wearing his sunglasses. Take those off, he ordered. Excuse me, Calvin, Rupert asked, raising an eyebrow. I said take the dang sunglasses off. It's in all caps. Rupert glanced at everyone looking at him, shrugged, and removed his sunglasses. Normal human eyes awaited everyone underneath. Calvin stared in a stupor. Wait, I can figure this out. Everyone rolled their eyes. Calvin was determined. You're not John Howard Chill. The man staring at Calvin looked around shiftily. Of course I am, Calvin. How can you say that? Because I can see the real John Chill coming up behind you. Oh my god, what is happening now? Everyone looked around and stared in open shock. Just as Calvin had said, the real John Howard Chill, looking very beaten and tired, but nonetheless alive, came stumbling up the pathway towards everyone, glaring at the fake Chill with an angry look in his eye. Side note, I mentioned in a previous recording that I was pretty sure that the human version of John Chill shows up in the Calvin the Hobbes the series of fanfics. I looked into this, and according to the Calvin the Hobbes the series TV tropes page, he ends up searching for immortality. So, that's wild. Don't know how that ends up happening with him, but just a fun little fact. Calvin, how did you know? Calvin smirked. Intuition, he said slyly. But if that's oh wait, I forgot. I've been voicing the aliens like they're Barney, but originally, I voiced the dad like he was Barney, so I haven't always done the voice for the aliens either, but you know what, I'm gonna try and be consistent here, so... But if that's John Chill, who's that? Dad asked, pointing at the imposter. Could it be? The SNR leader asked, looking at some papers. He waved some other rescuers over to look, and they all nodded in agreement. It is him. It is who? Mom asked. Rupert Chill, Calvin said proudly. Get him, the leader shouted, and they all descended upon Rupert Chill, knocking him to the ground. Get off! Get off! I have the right! An attorney! I have the right to remain silent! I have the right to knock off a 7-Eleven if I so wish! Don't know what that means. Everyone stared at the scuffle while finally Rupert Chill was handcuffed and brought up again. The real John Howard Chill glared at him before addressing the crowd. Oh my god, I just read a line ahead. Okay. So, you know how there was Rupert Chill, the alien, and there was John Chill, the human? It's about to get even more confusing. The real John Howard Chill glared at him before addressing the crowd. Everyone, this is my twin brother, Rupert Chill. As you can see, he has made some very bad choices in life, such as tying me up, stealing my uniform, and locking me in a closet, he said, yelling the last part at his brother. Yeah, so you caught me, Rupert Chill grumbled. Whatever, throw me in jail, why don't you? We'll see what happens. I assure you I'll be released in no time. Get in the car, Chill, the leader muttered, shoving Rupert Chill toward the police car. Chill glared at them before he was shoved away. Calvin, meanwhile, was putting his box back into the duffel bag. Wow, Hobbes commented. That was exciting. How do you figure it worked out? Simple, really, Calvin said. I suspect that the alien Rupert Chill abducted the human John Chill and posed as him, knowing that if he was ever caught, he could fall back on the human Rupert Chill and that he'd be arrested for impersonating John Chill. It was only lucky and possibly through alien influence that Rupert came here and decided to try it. But John Chill said that he'd been locked in a closet. False memories, most likely. In order to ensure their plans were kept secret, the aliens decided to revise John and Rupert Chill's memory so they'd think that all this happened. Rupert Chill didn't lock his brother in a closet. He only thinks he did. So wait, that means that there are two Rupert Chills? One alien and one human. Correct. How the heck? I don't know. It's a mystery for another day. Oh, joy of joys. Mom came over to Calvin. Come on, Calvin, it's time to take you home, she said. You probably need a bath. Calvin groaned. Oh, come on. But Mom grabbed his arm and took him into the car. We'll get you home, give you a bath, and then you can have dinner. Dad started up the car as they got in. You can have whatever you want for dinner, he said. Really? Anything? Calvin asked. Sure, what do you want? I have heard tell of a dish called haggis. Mom and Dad groaned as they headed out of the Camp Pine limits, but they were all unaware that just a distance behind them, watching them from the cabins, were Rupert and Earl, watching them angrily. Page break. Much to Calvin's horror, Mom and Dad declined for an interview on the local news station. This may have had something to do with the fact that Calvin was holding to his story that he was attacked by aliens trying to take over the world. Calvin got a little short article written about him in the local newspaper, which he proudly hung on his wall as a continuation of his resume. "All right," Calvin said a few days after the whole ordeal was over. He was standing outside in the backyard with Hobbes, both wearing paper hats, and Calvin was examining a crudely drawn map. "According to my calculations, this entire summer camp experience has destroyed an entire 2 weeks of our lives, and therefore robbed us of 1/3 of our summer. Therefore, we must cram all the nothing we can do into the remaining 2 months, 2 weeks before I have to re-enter the zombie-filled hell known as school." "Agreed," Hobbes saluted. "All right," Calvin held the map up and studied it closer. "According to the map, we must take exactly 300 paces to the northeast. Navigator Hobbes, show us to the northeast." Hobbes held up a compass and squinted at it. "That way," he said, pointing back toward the front door. Calvin and Hobbes looked at the door. "Well, okay, let's just take 300 paces into the forest," Calvin said finally. "Agreed," Hobbes said again, and with that the duo set off into the forest with their map and a shovel. For a minute they walked deeper into the forest, evidently not traumatized at all from what had happened to them, all the while counting as they walked. They paused for a moment to argue about something, and this is when, from the trees, yet again, out comes 2 figures. Stepping into the sunlight, Rupert and Earl glared furiously at Calvin and Hobbes, aiming their ray guns at them. Their tentacles were shaking from anger. "Oh, hi, Rupert," Calvin said casually. "What's up?" "You almost destroyed our entire plan, Earth Potentate," Rupert growled dangerously. "I'm not the Earth Potentate," Calvin sighed. "Shut up," Earl spat. Calvin shrugged. "I'm not. I mean, I can see why you think I am, but really, why would you believe a couple of aliens that don't even have arms?" Kinda ableist, to be honest. "What do you think, Hobbes?" Calvin turned to Hobbes, but he was frozen with fear and staring at Rupert and Earl with wide eyes. "Eep," he squeaked. "Calvin, you can't talk us out of believing who you are. We got the documents confirming it." "And where'd you get the documents?" Calvin asked. "Galaxoid gave them to us." Calvin closed his eyes. "And even if you aren't the Earth Potentate, will still need to be destroyed because you know our plan and therefore are a danger to it." Calvin shrugged. "I'm going to kill you, Calvin," Rupert said slowly. "Then I'm going to kill the President of the United States. Then I'm going to kill the leaders of all the other countries. Then I'm going to go down to each level of the government and kill them too. Governors, lawmakers, political satirists. Then, with the world left in shambles, I will send my army in to destroy every living being on this planet." "Dark," Calvin nodded. "However, you have forgotten to take one formidable force into consideration." Rupert and Earl stared at Calvin. "What? You?" Earl chuckled. Rupert and Earl started laughing at the thought. Calvin remained silent and waited for them to stop. "Nope," he said finally. "This." And with that, Calvin pulled a red CD player out of his pocket and pressed the play button. Kaboom! An explosion of electricity and fire shot from the tip of the CD player, engulfing Rupert and Earl and sending them flying backwards. "Ah!" they both screamed, falling into a heap onto the ground. Charred and confused, Rupert aimed his ray gun at Calvin and attempted to fire. Calvin pressed the button again. Kaboom! Arg! Once again, Rupert and Earl were flung a good 10 feet away from Calvin as the blast enveloped them. Calvin pressed the button again. Kaboom! 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 Rupert, now pressed against a tree several hundred feet away from where he had been before, glared at Calvin through his compound yellow eyes as he approached him. "I'll be back," he whispered threateningly. "Of course you will," Calvin said simply. "And because the FCC requires me to say it, I'll be ready." And with that, Calvin pushed another button on the CD player. There was another blast of electricity. However, this one was a teleporter. There was a bright flash of light, and Rupert and Earl vanished from where they lie. Calvin and Hobbes stared at the ground where they were standing for a while. Then Hobbes turned to Calvin. "So, what does that do?" Calvin looked at the CD player in his hands. "Oh, this? It's a prototype for my latest invention. I call it the MTM," he said proudly. "What does MTM stand for?" "I haven't decided yet," Calvin said. "So, what number were we on?" 68, I think, Hobbes said, scratching his head. "Ah, yes, I remember," Calvin said, snapping his fingers. "Let's resume." So MTM in the series ends up standing for Mini Time Machine. It ends up having quite a number of uses. It's kind of a multitask tool. It can travel through time, yes, but it can also shoot lasers like it just did now. It can scan things, it can probably hack into systems, I can't remember. And then after a certain point, Calvin ends up giving it a personality and a voice, and so it becomes a fully fledged character and member of the cast. Anyhow, I just scrolled ahead a little bit. I will have to explain some more lore, because I keep having to stop to explain stuff. But I'm gonna have to explain a few things, but we'll get to it when we get to it. Later that night, Calvin and Hobbes were preparing for bed. It had indeed been a long day. They had defeated a couple of freak aliens, dug up a treasure of rocks and sticks, held a gross reunion meeting, thrown a water balloon at Susan, searched for monsters in the basement with a baseball bat, Read comic books underneath the big maple tree at the top of Sneer Hill. Sneer Hill is the name of the hill that's in the forest in their backyard where they oftentimes ride their wagon. Rode down Sneer Hill in the wagon and falling off a cliff in the process. See, told you. Attempted to trick Mom into giving them the keys to the car, and fetched a Tyrannosaurus egg from the Cretaceous period, only to return it, deciding that Mom probably wouldn't allow them to keep a pet. Calvin and Hobbes crawled into bed and pulled the covers up to their heads. Well, Hobbes, it's certainly been an eventful summer so far, Calvin said, fluffing his pillow and lying down. Indeed it has, Hobbes nodded. What do you suppose the future shall hold? Calvin asked. Hobbes thought for a moment. Who knows? I heard that this kid moved into that old mansion down the street last week. I hear he has a tiger, he grinned. Hopefully one of those cute tigress babes we saw in the April issue of National Geographic. Huh, Calvin said, rolling onto his back. Interesting. I heard another kid moved in recently, too. I won't be seeing him in school, though, because he's supposedly homeschooled. I think his name is Andy? Calvin and Hobbes lied silently in their bed for a moment, staring at the ceiling in thought. So, in Calvin and Hobbes' series, we meet a few additional characters, some OCs, if you will, that are a part of this fanfic universe. One of them is another tiger, like Hobbes, named Socrates, because, he's a philosopher. He lives with the boy in the mansion down the street. The boy who he lives with is a pretty minor character, but Socrates spends an awful lot of time with Calvin and Hobbes, and also with Andy, because Andy ends up becoming a part of their friend group as well. And Andy isn't just any regular boy. He also has a pet named Sherman, who is a hamster. Not just any hamster, though. He is a hamster who has been experimented on, and so he has superhuman intelligence and is something of a scientist in his own right. And these characters eventually, though it takes a while for them all to be introduced in the series itself, become kind of the main cast of Calvin and Hobbes, the series. So what Swing 123 and Garfield Odie are doing here is kind of trying to connect the ending of this fic with where their other fics began. Anyhow, this is when Hobbes turns to Calvin. Do you think Rupert and Earl will ever come back? Probably. He said he would, Calvin shrugged. But I don't think we should really worry about that. Why? Hobbes asked. Calvin chuckled. Because as long as I'm here and living, good old Mr. President can rest assured that he's safe and sound, he said matter-of-factly. And with that, Calvin and the Hobbes fell asleep, wondering what adventures awaited them in the weeks to come. We got 2 more OCs to introduce the last section of this chapter. Ha ha! A tall man screamed with delight, leaping around his underground laboratory with glee. He had wild green hair that stuck straight up as if he had been electrocuted. He had electric blue eyes and was wearing a lab coat over his black t-shirt. At long last, I have finished the work on my deadly robot slave! The man rushed over to a work table where a tall silver robot was lying. He had a long pointy nose and segmented legs. His eyes were closed. As soon as he finishes charging, I will have a robotic servant that will tend to my every evil whim! And once that happens, I can send him into the government so that I can take over the world! And with that, he threw his hands into the air and laughed hysterically. Bwahahaha! Suddenly, a sound that sounded very much like a microwave beep sounded throughout the lab. Aha! The man screamed. He's done! He turned back to the table and watched the robot intently, rubbing his hands together with anticipation. Suddenly, the robot's eyes opened. Ha ha! The man screamed. Rise, robot! Rise from your slumber! I am your creator, Dr. Franklin Jackson Brainstorm! You will refer to me as Dr. Brainstorm! I will name you after my middle name so that all shall fear you forever. You will now obey me and speak your first words. Words that will ring out through humanity through the rest of eternity. Jack, for that is the name of the robot, stared at Brainstorm for a long throbbing moment. And finally he spoke. Of all the people that could have invented me, I got this nutwhack, he sighed heavily. Brainstorm stared at Jack in confusion. I was expecting kind of a raspy death voice, but I guess this will do, he shrugged. Now, go destroy the government! Jack sat up. No, I'm not really in the mood, he said, stepping off the table. I'm gonna see what's on TV. I can help myself to the refrigerator, right, Frank? And with that, the robot left Brainstorm standing there dumbfounded. Finally, he turned back towards the direction from which Jack had walked off. It's Dr. Brainstorm, he screamed at the top of his lungs. The end. So those 2 characters are also OCs from the Calvinverse. They end up becoming pretty major antagonists to Calvin and co. Although Dr. Brainstorm himself is a pretty damn inadequate scientist. Like, if you thought Dr. Doofenshmirtz was kind of sucky at being a villain, Dr. Brainstorm is worse. But that's how it ends, and if you want to see what kind of adventures they get up to with with all these new characters that have been introduced at the very end here, you're gonna have to read some of the series yourself. I'm sorry. But that is the end of Calvin and Hobbes, the movie rewritten. And I actually wrote up, if I can find them, some final words and thoughts, because I didn't want to just stutter through my final words. For starters, I hope you had as much fun listening to this as I did reading it aloud. And going on from there, I have some thoughts, some positive, mostly positive, but a few negative. And I'm going to start with the negatives first because I want to end on a positive. So some of the narration is kind of repetitious in this fic. The constant usage of there being long silences or characters staring or rolling their eyes, it feels like a bit much. It's too much, it's repetitious, and I think it's because the authors were quite young and maybe didn't have a grasp on like comedic timing, especially within the context of prose and how to get a joke across when you're writing. I imagine as well that they probably had seen TV shows where after a joke there'd be a beat or a moment, or maybe if a joke really needed the moment to sink in, a character would stare at another. And as such, they kind of used that as a reference point and just doubled down on that sort of thing, thinking that it maybe somehow helped add to the joke or helped give the scene some level of comedic timing or rhythm that they wouldn't have otherwise had. It kind of reminds me of the worst excesses of Disney sitcom acting, a lot of mugging, camping it up, more than necessary, that kind of thing. Besides that as well, the pacing is also a bit rough in a handful of chapters. There was only one that I felt like I needed to skip entirely, and that was the one after they got to summer camp and they were doing all the camp activities, because it was so long, you guys. Like, it did not need to be as long as it was. And I kind of feel that the ending to the fic also felt a little anticlimactic. Like, there was this really long denouement with them going back to their house and, like, introducing the MTM and these OCs that are a major part of the Calvinverse and all that. And it kind of, I don't think it entirely bogged things down, but it did make the climax where they were just kind of flying through the woods to get to Camp Pine feel a little less exciting than I think it could have been. I don't know. However, with that in mind, there is a lot to like here. There are some genuinely funny jokes in here that aren't marred by the constant eye rolling or staring or what have you. There were several times in reading this that you likely noticed I audibly laughed or had to pause because I found something funny. And speaking of humor, while the creators of this did have a penchant for including plot ideas or jokes from movies and cartoons that they liked, I think a majority of the jokes in this fic at least were original, and props to them for that. Like, y'all are funny. That's all there is to it. You're funny. The alien crew being stupid could be annoying, and I feel like in some of their other works I've read I found them to be, but I found them humorous and endearing here, so maybe that's just me looking at these fics from a different perspective now that I'm older. I don't really know. I also liked, and I mentioned this, that they tried to include things like the GROSS meetings or Spaceman Spiff and so on, and that they tried to include those along with as many recurring gags and bits and pieces from the comic as possible. And I also just really like the premise of this. It's the sort of thing that someone absolutely would pitch for the premise of a Calvin and Hobbes TV movie, if one were to be made. It's also exactly the kind of thing that the strip's creator, Bill Watterson, would have hated, and the kind of thing that he feared his strip being turned into by licensing. But considering that this exists not as an official film, but as a fun work of fanfiction, that doesn't really bother me. Something about it just works for me. I don't know. It feels like this is what the movie could have ended up being. And with that in mind, I think that the stakes for it are appropriately high, and not just because of the alien invasion, but also in the bits where Calvin and Hobbes are lost in the woods. They feel serious and tense, and the whole Camp Pine setup adds to this too. It's taking characters we already know and is taking them out of their usual place and context and is putting them into a brand new location where they've got new things to do and new challenges to face, which just feels like the kind of thing you want to do in a movie, you know? Like, set it apart from the more mundane comic strip. I don't think the comic strip is mundane, but, you know, just for contrast, that's what I mean. It just feels appropriately epic to me in the way that you'd want a movie to. Does that make any sense? I hope so. I also mentioned this before, but it tied a lot of lore in from the comic, whilst also introducing or including new lore quite seamlessly, except for the ending, which I felt a little tacked on to me, but like, I liked it still. I also think there's something kind of endearing about kids or tweens using Calvin and Hobbes to channel their own fantasies to tell stories based on the media that they personally love. In Calvin and Hobbes, the comic strip, Bill Watterson frequently showed Calvin disassociating and fantasizing, but I honestly don't know if the things that Calvin fantasized about were things a child in the actual 1980s would be fantasizing about. I get the impression that Bill Watterson was more taking inspiration from media he himself grew up with or personally really enjoyed, so that's why we get things like the film noir setup. I can't prove that, that is the impression I get. And with that in mind, there's something that just feels kind of right to me about a child or teen then taking these characters that frequently escaped into imagination to just deal with their own mundane reality, and then using those characters for their own personal fantasies, putting Calvin and Hobbes into all new situations based on media that they themselves liked. And maybe in this context of the fanfiction, these situations are entirely real, which contrasts with the comic strip where they are always just imagined. But, I don't know, it just feels like a sort of passing the torch, or someone reaching out and kind of using Calvin and Hobbes in a way that feels strangely in line with some of the broader themes of imagination and creativity that existed in the strip already. Does that make sense? I hope so. Now, there are a lot of reasons why I have a lot of fondness for these fics. Not just this one in particular, but the other ones the writers of this series wrote as well. And part of that is my own love for Calvin and Hobbes, yes, but it's not the only reason. The creators seem to enjoy a lot of the same media I did when I was reading this, and similar media that I liked when I was growing up. In the early seasons, especially the first season of Calvin and Hobbes, the series, there's just constant references to media, like really on-the-nose pastiches or send-ups of things from TV shows and books and the like that the creators liked. This included things like A Series of Unfortunate Events, Garfield and Friends, Hank the Cowdog, Doctor Who, both new and classic, as well as MST3K, and all of these are things which personally I had a fondness for at one point or another, and a lot of these properties were ones which I had never met anyone IRL who were fans of. Like, I didn't know anyone else who enjoyed watching Garfield and Friends growing up, and I didn't know anyone else who read the Hank the Cowdog books. And so when I stumbled onto a fanfic based on a comic strip I loved that started referencing them constantly, it was a little surreal for me. Like, I'm not sure if I can get that across, but it felt strange. I didn't always love how much they lifted from other sources, and to be clear, after the first season or two, they do it much less, and, like, the Calvin and Hobbes series fanfictions are worth reading. It just felt surreal. Like, I'm rambling here, but because I saw these references to things that I also cared deeply about in this fic, I felt like, in a weird parasocial way, that I'd stumbled onto two people who I could have been friends with if they'd lived nearby me, you know? That's how I felt when I was 13 or 14, or however old I was when I first started reading these. If Swing123 or Garfield Odie are watching, I'm sorry for trash-talking your fic when I was younger, as there's a lot to like, and I hope me explaining, like, the weird parasocial connection I felt with you guys isn't too weird. Like, I don't know, you guys, you're not my friends. That's fine. It's not like, I'm not saying that because I'm offended, I'm just saying it as it's a fact. I want to thank the both of you for the gift that is the Calvinverse. I have a lot of good memories of reading through those fics, and even nowadays sometimes revisiting them. And as for everyone else watching, if this video piqued your interest, I would recommend giving the fics a look. Start either midway through season 2 or with season 3 of Calvin and Hobbes the series. The first season is really rough, just don't bother. Trust me. And who knows, maybe one day I'll revisit this shared universe of fics in another video. I can't really say. Garfield Odie did in fact write a rewritten version of Can You Imagine That, which was his take on a Calvin and Hobbes movie, which could be fun to talk about. And, yeah, I think that's it for now. Did you read these growing up like I did? Did you love Calvin and Hobbes growing up, even if you didn't? Are there other fanfics you'd love to see me read on here? I'd love to hear from you. So if you've got responses to any of these questions or have any thoughts in general, please comment below. If you're new here, please subscribe. I've got a lot of other fun fandom and fanfic related videos in my backlog, and I'm working on several other big ones related to similar things for this coming year already. And yeah, I'll be seeing y'all soon. I've begun college again at university, as it's called here in the UK. And so I'm unsure when the next video is going to be out because I'm going to get pretty busy in the next few weeks. And as such, I think this may actually be the last video of the year. And if it is, I hope you enjoyed it, and then I hope that your holidays go okay. Yeah, that's me signing off. I'll see you soon.